Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. Have you ever received something in the mail that wasn't meant for you? A letter, a package, something that seemed just slightly off but still caught your attention enough to wonder about it? I had. It was an ordinary morning, just like any other. I had been sitting in my small, dimly lit apartment, the coffee cup in my hand still warm from the first sip. The sun was barely starting to rise, casting a soft golden hue across the room. The hum of the city outside was a quiet backdrop to my thoughts until the sound of the mail slot opening broke through. I wasn't expecting anything that day, yet there it was, an envelope, wedged awkwardly through the narrow opening of the door. At first, I thought it might have been a mistake, a stray piece of junk mail from a neighbor. But as I stepped forward to pick it up, my name caught my attention. It was addressed to me, but there was something off about the address. The handwriting was neat, almost too perfect. But what stood out most was the address itself. It wasn't my apartment number, nor even the building I lived in. The street name was familiar, but the number? I had never seen it before. It wasn't my address. Curiosity got the better of me, and I ripped the envelope open, pulling out a single piece of paper. My fingers brushed against it, and I could feel the weight of something strange about to unfold. Inside was a photograph. It was a place I recognized immediately. A place I had dreamed of visiting for years, but never had the chance. The photograph was taken at an angle that seemed personal, intimate, as though someone had been standing right where I would have stood if I had ever made the journey. The photo showed an old, withered lighthouse perched on a cliff by the sea. The sky was stormy, clouds swirling above with a dark, ominous hue. The waves below crashed violently against the rocks, as though nature itself was raging. It looked like a place on the edge of the world, a place that promised solitude, quiet, escape. But what was it doing in my hands? I sat there for a moment, frozen in confusion, the photo pressed to my chest. The photo was real, the location real. But the letter, the address, it didn't make sense. It wasn't meant for me, I knew that. But how had it found its way here? More importantly, why? I placed the photo down carefully on the coffee table and took a deep breath. There had to be an explanation, a rational one. Maybe it was some kind of mistake, some mix-up at the post office. A misplaced letter. Nothing more. But something in me, deep in my gut, told me that this was no accident. It couldn't be. How could something so precise, so personal, be a mere mistake? I turned the envelope over, hoping to find some clue, something that could explain the strange, misplaced letter. But there was nothing. No return address, no sign of where it had come from. I could have just tossed it aside, forgotten about it. But the photograph stayed with me. I couldn't shake the thought of that lighthouse, the quiet, distant place, calling to me in a way that made my skin tingle. I had to know more. Something about it felt like it was meant for me, something more than just a mistake. And as I stared at the photograph, the thought that had been quietly nagging at the back of my mind came to the forefront. What if it wasn't a mistake at all? What if it was a message? And if it was, who was trying to send it? A shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that the letter, whatever its purpose, was trying to tell me something. It was more than just a random piece of mail. It felt like a sign, something that reached beyond coincidence. The question that kept echoing in my mind was, why me? I spent the rest of the morning pacing my small apartment, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it someone who knew me? Someone who was trying to get my attention? I glanced at the photo again, my fingers lightly tracing the edge of the lighthouse in the picture. It seemed so real, as if the photographer had stood there only moments before. I decided I couldn't just leave it at that. I had to find out where this place was, and why I was being drawn to it. If the photograph was meant for me, then the journey to this lighthouse would be something more than just a trip. It would be a call to action. I got online and began searching. I typed in everything I could think of: lighthouse, stormy sea, cliff edge, and withered lighthouse. There were hundreds of pictures of lighthouses, but none quite like the one in my photo. Some came close, but they weren't quite right. Something about the shape, the angle, the eerie quality of the photo. It was as if the lighthouse in the image didn't belong to this world. I couldn't place it. Hours passed, and my search led to nothing. My frustration grew. The more I looked, the more I felt like I was chasing a ghost, something that didn't exist. But something told me that it wasn't a dead end. It wasn't. It couldn't be. The photo was a clue, and I had to follow it. I needed to see the lighthouse with my own eyes. That evening, I left my apartment and headed to the library, hoping to find something in the archives. Maybe an old travel guide or some obscure reference to this lighthouse. The library was quiet, nearly empty. I scanned through old books, photos, and travel journals, but the hours ticked by, and I came up with nothing. As I was about to give up for the night, I stumbled across a dusty, old photo album tucked away in a forgotten corner of the library. Its pages were yellowed with age, and the cover was cracked. The title, Seaside History, was barely legible. It looked like something from another era, something no one had touched in years. I opened it carefully, as though afraid to disturb the fragile pages. And there it was. A photograph of the same lighthouse. The same stormy sky. The same cliff edge. But this time, the caption read, "The Lighthouse of Forgotten Souls, abandoned in 1921. I felt a cold wave wash over me. The name sent chills down my spine. Forgotten Souls? The words seemed so final, so ominous. What did it mean? Who had written it? I turned the page, my heart racing. There were other photos of the same place, but with no clear explanation. The lighthouse, long abandoned, had been a mystery even then. No one had ever known who built it, or why. It was as if it had been erected for no reason at all, only to be forgotten, left to decay along with the lives of those who might have lived nearby. But the strangest thing was the last photo, the one that nearly stopped my heart. It was the same lighthouse, taken from a different angle. But in the background, behind the structure, there was something else. A shadow. A shape that didn't belong. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A figure standing at the base of the lighthouse, its face obscured by the dark. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if it had no business being there at all. I blinked, feeling dizzy. Could it be the same place from the photo? The one that had arrived in my mailbox? No, it couldn't be. This photograph was from decades ago. The shadow in the image felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to be captured. A thought crossed my mind, one I couldn't ignore. What if the photograph, the letter, and the lighthouse were all connected in some way? What if it was trying to tell me something? And if it was, why now? As I closed the album and stood up, a sense of unease settled over me. The more I tried to unravel the mystery, the more it seemed to slip away, becoming something more elusive, more dangerous. And the question that lingered, refusing to leave me, was who had sent the letter to me, and why? I had to go there, to that lighthouse. But something inside me whispered, be careful. You may not return the same way you left. I didn't know what I was about to walk into, but deep down, I knew that the journey ahead would reveal something I wasn't prepared to face. And I had no choice but to find out. The decision was made. I couldn't turn back now. I packed a small bag with the essentials, my wallet, phone, a flashlight, and a few other things, before heading out to the nearest bus station. The lighthouse had to be real. I couldn't let it haunt me any longer. The bus ride was long, and I found myself staring out of the window at the passing countryside, the world outside growing darker as I moved further from home. My mind kept circling back to the photograph, to the shadow that shouldn't have been there. I couldn't get it out of my head, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark figure lurking behind the lighthouse, just out of reach. I kept telling myself that it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking everything. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something unsettling about that place, something that drew me like a moth to a flame. The sun had already set by the time I arrived at the nearest town. It was small, quiet, seemingly normal. Yet there was an undeniable sense of isolation in the air. As I made my way to the edge of town, the roads grew emptier, the buildings more spaced out. The lighthouse wasn't far now, according to the directions I had found on an old map I stumbled upon at the library. The weather had shifted as well. A fog rolled in, thick and heavy, swallowing up the streetlights as I drove further down the narrow road. My car's headlights cut through the mist, but it felt like I was driving into a void, a place that wasn't meant to be found. I couldn't see far ahead, and my unease grew. Eventually, I came to a dead end, a long, winding dirt road leading up to a cliff. I parked the car at the edge and got out, feeling the cold wind bite at my skin as the fog pressed in. The air smelled salty, like the sea, and a faint sound of waves crashing against the rocks below filled the silence. But there was something else, too. A low hum, almost imperceptible, that seemed to vibrate in the air. The lighthouse was there, just ahead, emerging out of the mist like a ghost from another time. It was tall, weathered, and old, just like the photographs had shown. But up close, it was even more imposing. The stone was chipped and eroded, its once bright white paint now faded and peeling. It looked as if it hadn't been touched in decades. I felt a cold chill run through me as I walked toward it, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the thick fog. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave this place behind. But I couldn't. I had to know what it was all about. The entrance to the lighthouse was locked, but there was a small side door that appeared to be ajar. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open, stepping inside. The air inside was stale and damp, thick with the smell of mildew and rust. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the interior, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. The walls were lined with old, faded photographs of the lighthouse, just like the ones in the library. But unlike the photos, these seemed more recent. The figures in them were blurred, distorted, and the edges of the pictures were frayed as though they had been hastily shoved into place. I stepped further into the darkened room, my breath shallow. The hum from outside had grown louder now, almost like a low whisper. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, deep in the walls, in the floorboards, even in the air around me. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. There, at the base of the stairs leading to the lighthouse tower, was something new. It was small, hidden in the shadows, a bundle of old, decayed letters tied with a thick string. I approached cautiously, picking up the bundle. The paper was brittle and yellowed, the ink faded and almost illegible. As I untied the string and flipped through the letters, I caught a name. Claire Holloway. The same name appeared in every letter, written in different handwritings, all telling the same story. The letters were full of desperate pleas for help, written in the 1920s, some even from the 1910s. The words were frantic, begging Claire to leave the lighthouse, to run far away, to escape whatever dark force had taken root there. The handwriting was almost unrecognizable in places, as if the writers had been in a panic. But one letter stood out, written in an elegant, flowing script, almost like a final confession. Do not go near the light. The shadow will find you, as it found me. There is no escape. It will follow you beyond the lighthouse. Forever. I dropped the letters, my hands shaking. A coldness had crept up my spine. I backed away from the bundle, my breath coming faster now. What was this? Why were these letters here? And why was I the one who had found them? I had to leave. But as I turned toward the door, I noticed something in the corner of the room. A figure, dark and formless, standing just inside the threshold of the lighthouse tower. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was the same shadow from the photograph, the one I had seen in the library. It was no longer just a blur in a picture. It was real. And it was waiting for me. I couldn't breathe. My legs wouldn't move. And then the figure started to move toward me, slowly, deliberately. I ran. I didn't think, I just ran. The door slammed behind me, the wind howling as I stumbled down the stairs and out into the fog. But I could still hear it. The hum. The whisper. Growing louder. Closer. And in the mist, I could feel it, the shadow was following me. I didn't stop running. I couldn't. My feet pounded against the dirt road as I dashed toward the car, the sound of the shadow following me just behind, its presence pressing down on me, suffocating. The air felt thick, heavier with every breath I took. The fog was dense, like a living thing, wrapping around me and pulling me into its depths. My heart raced faster than my legs, a frantic beat that echoed in my ears. I reached the car, almost tripping over my own feet as I fumbled with the door. My hands were slick with sweat, trembling uncontrollably as I finally managed to get the door open. I slammed it shut and threw the car into gear, the engine roaring to life. I didn't look back. The road ahead was a blur, the headlights cutting through the fog in short, sharp bursts. I felt like I was being pulled, like I was caught between two worlds. The shadow was still there, lurking, waiting for me to slip up. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was right behind me, just beyond the edge of the light. Every turn I took, every straightaway I drove, I felt it getting closer. And when I looked into the rearview mirror, I saw nothing but the swirling mist. But I knew better. It was there. I could feel it. The lighthouse was gone from view, swallowed up by the fog. I tried to convince myself that I was safe, that I had left whatever that thing was behind. But the feeling of dread wouldn't let up. My skin crawled, and the air felt colder than it should have been, even with the car's heater running full blast. I had to get home. I needed to be somewhere familiar, somewhere safe. The drive back felt like an eternity. The road twisted and turned like a labyrinth, and no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in. I was sure I wasn't alone in the car. But when I glanced over at the passenger seat, it was empty, just like it should have been. I passed the town, then the outskirts, the darkness thickening around me. I was getting closer to the main highway, and that thought offered some comfort. But as I drove past a row of trees, something caught my eye. A figure, standing still by the side of the road. It was too far to see clearly, just a dark shape, barely visible in the fog. I slowed down, instinctively. But the figure didn't move. It was only when I was almost upon it that I realized it was staring right at me. My pulse quickened as I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the wet pavement. I jerked the car to a stop and stared at the figure in the darkness. It was a person, or it looked like a person, but there was something wrong about it. Something off. It stood motionless, just watching me, as if it had been waiting for me all along. I didn't know why, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. It didn't seem human. The shape was too still, too perfect in its unnaturalness. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively reached for my phone. But as I looked away for just a moment, the figure was gone. It had vanished into the fog. I quickly turned the car around, desperate to get out of there. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The road stretched out before me, but the unease still lingered, hanging in the air like a cloud I couldn't escape. I drove faster now, the sound of my car engine roaring in the stillness. And then, just as I thought I was finally breaking free of the fear that had gripped me since I left the lighthouse, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure. It wasn't the one from the side of the road, but it was unmistakable. It was the same shadow that had stalked me in the lighthouse. And it was following me. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure grew closer in the mirror, the outline shifting and darkening as if it was growing larger, gaining on me with every passing second. I didn't stop. I couldn't. But no matter how fast I drove, the shadow stayed there, right behind me, like a relentless predator. I could feel it closing in, and it was all I could do to keep my hands steady on the wheel. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see the road ahead. The headlights barely pierced the mist, and it felt like the world had shrunk to nothing but the dark and the shadow that followed. I reached the highway, the familiar stretch of road finally in sight. But as I tried to accelerate, I heard a sound, a faint scraping noise, like nails dragging against metal. The car lurched forward, as if something heavy had just jumped onto the roof. My heart skipped a beat as I forced myself to look out of the window. And there, on the roof of my car, was a figure, a silhouette, standing motionless as it clung to the metal. I could see nothing but darkness in its shape, its face an unrecognizable blur. I screamed, slamming the brakes hard. The figure slid off the car with an unnatural speed, disappearing into the fog as if it had never been there. I was left alone on the highway, my pulse racing, my hands shaking as I sat frozen in the driver's seat. I didn't know what I had just seen. I didn't know if I had imagined it, if it was the shadow from the lighthouse, or something else. But as I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I realized something chilling. Whatever it was, it had found me. And now, it was waiting. I couldn't sit there any longer. Every second felt like an eternity, the tension suffocating me. I had to get out. I had to leave. But where could I go? The shadow was still out there, waiting. I was trapped, and the familiar world around me now felt foreign, as if the very ground I stood on was shifting beneath my feet. I forced myself to start the car again, gripping the wheel with a tightness that burned my hands. My mind was spinning, the image of the shadow on the roof seared into my memory. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching into the fog like a dark tunnel. The headlights barely illuminated anything more than a few feet in front of me. My breath was shallow, my body tense, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. I drove for what felt like hours, though I couldn't tell for sure. The fog seemed to press in around me, closer, darker, as though it was alive, watching, responding to my every move. The feeling of being followed was overwhelming, suffocating. I kept checking the mirrors, but each time, the same emptiness stared back at me until I'd look away, and then I felt it again. That presence. I passed the small town again, the one I'd driven through earlier. Everything was quiet, too quiet. The houses, the buildings, everything was silent, as if the town had been abandoned. I didn't want to stop, but the emptiness of it all felt wrong. I didn't know what had happened to it, but something in me knew that I couldn't just ignore it. I pulled into the town, slowly rolling through the deserted streets. The buildings loomed over me, dark and oppressive, their windows like black eyes, staring blankly. It was impossible to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching from the shadows. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long, distorted shadows that twisted in the fog. And then I saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the street. It was far away, but unmistakable. A tall, dark shape, just standing there, unmoving. My heart stopped. The figure was the same one I had seen outside the lighthouse, the same one that had followed me down the road. I couldn't breathe. My foot hovered over the brake, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. I couldn't let it get closer. But it did. With unnatural speed, the figure glided toward me, its movements too fluid, too quick. The air grew colder, and the fog thickened, swirling around the car. The engine sputtered, the headlights flickering. And then, everything went dark. The car died. I slammed my hands on the wheel, panic rising in my chest. I tried to restart the engine, but the ignition was silent. The figure was closer now, just a few feet away, its shape shifting in and out of the mist, as if it were dissolving and reforming with each step. The faint outline of its face was distorted, a featureless mask of shadow, but I could feel its gaze. I could feel it reaching for me. I scrambled to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. My hands were slick with sweat, my fingers shaking as I desperately pulled at the handle. The air was thick with something, I didn't know what, but it tasted wrong, bitter, and heavy. The figure stopped just in front of my car, standing perfectly still. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Leave me alone," I whispered, the words barely audible over the deafening silence. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move, didn't speak. But it didn't need to. The pressure in the air was enough. I could feel it creeping into my chest, squeezing the breath out of me, tightening around my heart. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the figure was gone. Just like that, vanished into the fog. I sat there, frozen, unable to move. The silence felt deafening. The fog, the figure, it was all too much, too unreal. I looked around, but there was nothing, no trace of what had just happened. It was as if it had never been there. But I knew better. I knew it had. It was real. And now, it was only a matter of time before it came back. I finally forced myself to open the door, stumbling out of the car into the cold night. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I needed to find somewhere safe, somewhere to hide, because whatever had been following me wasn't going to stop. I ran. Have you ever looked at a map and wondered if there was something wrong with it? Not just a misplaced street or an outdated name, but something deeper, something that didn't belong, yet was staring you in the face? I did, one evening, when I found myself holding a strange map. It wasn't something I asked for. I didn't even know where it had come from. One moment, it wasn't there, and the next, it was sitting on the passenger seat of my car, folded neatly and waiting to be unfolded. It looked almost like a regular map of my city, with streets and neighborhoods I recognized. But there were subtle differences. The roads seemed to merge into places I didn't know. The blocks were shifted, some buildings had disappeared, and new ones had appeared in their place. And there was something odd about the way the streets curved, almost unnatural, like the map had been drawn by someone who had no real concept of how roads should align. But what truly caught my attention was a small red X marked in the corner of the map. It wasn't near any particular landmark, but it was placed in an area I knew well, a part of the city I had driven through countless times. Curious, I decided to go there. I didn't know why. Maybe it was the strange draw of the X, or maybe it was just the kind of day where everything felt a bit off. Either way, I grabbed my keys and headed out, not fully aware of the creeping sense of unease that was already beginning to settle in my gut. The air was cool, the kind of evening chill that made you wish you had worn a jacket, but not cold enough to be uncomfortable. As I drove through the familiar streets, everything seemed normal until I reached the spot marked by the red X. I had been here before. It was an empty lot now, a place that had once been home to a small diner I used to visit as a kid. It had closed down years ago, left to rot, the building long gone. But there it was, in the middle of the lot, the thing that had stopped my heart. My old bicycle. I had lost it when I was 12. It was a simple, blue bike, nothing special, but it had been mine. And I had searched for it for months when it went missing. Never found it. I assumed it had been stolen, or perhaps I had simply misplaced it. But here it was, right in front of me. I pulled over to the curb, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The bike stood there, propped up against a rusted pole, looking untouched by time. The paint was still intact, the tires still inflated. I didn't understand. How could it be here? Why was it here? My mind raced through all the logical explanations. Some kids had found it and left it here, maybe, but the air around me felt thick, wrong. There was something off about the whole situation. I stepped out of the car, the sound of my shoes on the gravel filling the silence of the evening. The closer I got to the bike, the more I felt like I was walking in a dream, like none of this was real. It didn't make sense. I was sure I hadn't imagined losing it. I was sure it had vanished years ago. And yet, here it was. I reached out to touch it, my fingers brushing against the cold metal frame. It was real. Solid. But my heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then I heard a sound behind me. A rustling. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking toward me. I turned, but no one was there. I looked back at the bike, my hand still resting on the frame. And then it hit me. The map. The red X. This was all connected somehow. But how? I didn't have the answers. I didn't even know where to start. All I knew was that my mind was racing, and the world around me was starting to feel wrong, distorted, like I was standing in the middle of a dream that I couldn't wake up from. The footsteps stopped. I turned again, but this time I didn't look around. I didn't need to. I knew. Someone, or something, was watching me. A chill ran down my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself I was just being paranoid. It wasn't like I could see anyone, but the sensation was unmistakable. I looked at the bike once more, my fingers still gripping the handlebars. Something inside me told me to leave, to get back in the car and drive away. But I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It was just a bike. Just a lost memory. But now it felt like more. It felt like a sign. Or maybe it was a trap. I didn't know which. But I did know one thing. I couldn't stay here. Not with that feeling gnawing at me, making my pulse race. I turned quickly, heading back to the car. And that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the shadows of the lot, just out of reach of the dim streetlight. I couldn't make out any features, just the outline of someone watching me. And I knew this wasn't over. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me as I hurried back to the car, my footsteps sounding too loud against the quiet of the empty lot. The figure in the shadows didn't move. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence as if it was etched into the very air around me. I reached my car and fumbled for the door handle. My fingers were trembling, my mind racing through every possibility. Who was that? Why was I feeling so exposed? I glanced back over my shoulder before getting in, half expecting to see the figure closer now, its face somehow illuminated by the glow of the streetlight. But it was gone. The lot was empty. Just the bike, still leaning against the pole. I slammed the door shut and started the engine. The car sputtered to life, the sound of the engine filling the space with something that felt almost normal. But I didn't feel normal. I felt like I was in a movie, like I was trapped in a scene where the rules of reality didn't apply. The bike, the shadow, the map, it all felt like a puzzle I couldn't solve. A puzzle I didn't want to solve. I took a deep breath and pulled away, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. I half expected to see someone following me, but there was nothing. Just the empty streets and the dim glow of the streetlights. I drove for a while, my mind trying to make sense of everything. The bike had to be some kind of coincidence, right? A random twist of fate that just happened to lead me to something from my past. But that didn't explain the map. The red X. Or the feeling that something was out of place. I glanced at the map again, which was still on the passenger seat. The streets had started to look even stranger the more I stared at them. More out of place. The lines and curves twisted in ways that didn't make sense, like the map was slowly changing as I drove. I rubbed my eyes. Was I imagining it? Was it the stress, the exhaustion from the long day, playing tricks on my mind? I couldn't stop myself from pulling over again. The map was calling to me, drawing my attention back to it like a magnetic force. I unfolded it carefully. This time, the streets looked even more distorted. The red X was now in a completely different spot, further outside the city, in an area I didn't recognize at all. I had to go there. I didn't know why, but I couldn't ignore the pull. Something in my gut told me I needed to. I took a deep breath and started the car again, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. The road stretched before me, the headlights cutting through the dark, illuminating the path ahead. As I drove, the silence in the car felt heavier, like the world around me was holding its breath. The streets started to change. The familiar turns I knew so well became unfamiliar. Buildings that had always been there were suddenly missing, replaced by empty fields, abandoned lots. The city felt like it was falling away, like I was driving into some other version of it, a version where nothing was real. My hands were slick with sweat as I navigated the unfamiliar roads. The map kept shifting in my hands, the streets rearranging themselves like some kind of living thing. The further I went, the more distant the world behind me seemed. And then, I saw it. The road ended at a tall, rusted gate. Beyond it was an overgrown path that seemed to lead into a dense forest. It was a place I had never seen before, and yet, the map clearly marked it as the destination. I stopped the car, the engine idling as I stared at the gate. The map, now crumpled in my hands, seemed almost alive, pulsing with a strange energy. I couldn't stop myself from getting out of the car. My body moved without my consent, my feet taking slow, hesitant steps toward the gate. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, the kind that makes you feel like you're not alone. The rustling of the leaves in the distance seemed too far away to be real. As I got closer to the gate, I noticed something strange. There was a bicycle chained to the post beside it. My heart skipped a beat. It was my bike. The same blue bicycle from the lot. The same old frame. The same familiar handlebars. And yet, it was somehow different, older, more worn, like it had been left here for years. I froze. My mind spun, struggling to process what I was seeing. There was no way this could be happening. No way that bike could be here, just like the one I had lost so long ago. But the more I stared at it, the more real it became. The sound of footsteps behind me broke the trance. I turned, heart pounding in my chest. And there it was again, the figure. But this time, it wasn't in the shadows. It was standing in the open, just a few feet away from me. It was a person, me. Or, at least, it looked like me. The same clothes. The same face. The same posture. But the eyes, they were wrong. There was something dark in them, something empty. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. It stepped closer, its gaze fixed on mine. And then, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice cold and hollow. "But now that you're here, there's no turning back." The air grew colder, the world around me seemed to close in, and the rustling leaves now sounded like whispers. And just as I took a step back, I felt it, the weight of the past, pressing in on me. The weight of everything I had lost, everything I had left behind. The figure stepped closer still, its smile twisting into something sinister. And I knew, in that moment, that this was just the beginning. The figure, me, or something that looked like me, stood just a few steps away now, its presence suffocating, as if it was not just in front of me but inside me, filling up every space I had left for air. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My heart thundered in my chest, the sound so loud I thought it might echo into the silence that hung heavy around us. The figure didn't say anything more. It just stood there, watching me with those hollow eyes that seemed to reach deep into me. It wasn't like looking at a mirror. No. It was like looking at something wrong, something out of place. The smile that curled at the edges of its lips was too wide, too unnatural. It wasn't the kind of smile a person would wear. It was the smile of something that had no soul. I stumbled back, the ground uneven beneath my feet. My mind screamed for me to turn and run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. From myself. "What do you want?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. It was weak, trembling, barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it tilted its head, as if studying me, examining me like a curiosity. Then, it spoke again, but this time its voice was off. It wasn't quite mine, but it was close, just close enough to make me shiver. "You've been following the map, haven't you?" it asked, its voice carrying a strange edge, like it was mocking me. "You think you're looking for answers, but all you're doing is following a trail that's already been set for you." I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but the words were stuck in my throat. The air around me felt thick, suffocating. My hands were clammy, my body trembling with a coldness I couldn't explain. The figure took a step forward, and I instinctively took a step back, bumping into the rusted gate. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to obey. My body was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of the moment. "You don't belong here," it said, its smile widening. "None of this is real. Not you. Not me. Not this place." A cold gust of wind swept through the clearing, and I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around myself. The trees whispered in the distance, their branches creaking like old bones. But the figure, the thing that looked like me, remained still, its eyes fixed on mine with a chilling intensity. "I don't understand," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. "What do you want from me?" The figure's smile faltered for just a moment. "What do I want? You really don't know, do you?" It took another step forward, and the sound of its footsteps was unnaturally loud in the silence. "I'm not the one who wants something. You're the one who's been searching for this. You're the one who came here. You chose to follow the map." My chest tightened. It wasn't just speaking. It was accusing me. And suddenly, everything felt like it was closing in. The world around me seemed to distort, the trees bending in impossible angles, the ground beneath me shifting like it was a dream. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. No, I didn't choose this. I didn't choose any of this. But the figure only laughed, softly, almost pityingly. "You think you have control? You think you can escape?" It stepped closer again, its cold breath sending a shiver down my spine. "You're already too deep in this. The map has already marked you. There's no way out now." Its words struck me like a blow. My head was spinning. The map. The bike. The place. It was all connected. All leading me to this moment. I looked down at the map again, still crumpled in my hand. It felt like it had burned itself into my skin. My fingers were shaking, but I couldn't stop holding it. I couldn't stop looking at it. "There's no escape," the figure said again, its voice now eerily soft. "You will follow it. Always. And you will never stop looking." Suddenly, I understood. I understood that the map wasn't just a piece of paper. It wasn't just a guide. It was a force. It had chosen me. It had marked me. And I would never be able to escape it. The figure raised its hand, pointing directly at me, and my chest constricted, a sharp pain lancing through my ribs. The map in my hand burned hotter, its edges seeming to shimmer and warp. My body felt like it was on fire, and the figure's smile only deepened. "You are the one who called me," it said, its voice low, almost a growl. "You're the one who brought me here. And now, you'll never be free." I couldn't breathe. The world seemed to crumble around me. The sky twisted into dark, swirling clouds. The trees bent toward me, their branches reaching like fingers. The ground beneath me cracked open, revealing nothing but endless darkness. I screamed, but no sound came. And then, in an instant, the world stopped. Silence. I looked around, disoriented, and found myself standing alone in the middle of the clearing. The figure was gone. The map was gone. The gate was gone. It was as if the whole world had swallowed them up. But it didn't feel like the world had returned to normal. It felt wrong. I was still in that place. That place where time and space didn't make sense. And the worst part? I was still holding the map. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at the empty air around me. My mind was a fog, and every inch of my body screamed to run, but I couldn't. I didn't know where to go. Didn't know where the map would take me next. But I knew one thing for sure. I would follow it. Because I had no choice. The silence was oppressive, thick with the weight of the unknown. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to clutch the map with both of them to keep it steady. I couldn't seem to tear my gaze away from it, even though I knew I should. The streets on the map were still there, though now they looked even more distorted, like they were shifting with each passing second. I tried to make sense of where I was. The place felt familiar in some way, but I couldn't place why. The air was too still, too stagnant, like it hadn't moved in years. And the ground beneath my feet felt soft, too soft, like it was absorbing the sound of my footsteps. My breath came in shallow bursts as I stumbled forward. Each step felt like I was walking on the edge of something I couldn't quite see. It wasn't fear that gripped me, it was something worse, something more insidious. A sense of inevitability, like I had already made my choices and now they were being played out, one moment at a time. The map in my hand seemed to pulse, urging me forward. I took another step, then another, the air growing colder, the trees around me bending closer, their branches twisting like fingers reaching for me. I could hear the faint sound of rustling leaves in the distance, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Only shadows. Only empty space. I don't know how long I walked, minutes, hours, maybe longer. The world felt like it was folding in on itself, with every step taking me further away from everything I knew. And then, ahead of me, I saw something. Something familiar. A streetlight. But not just any streetlight. It was the one from the map, the one marked with the red X. I quickened my pace, my pulse racing, my heart thundering in my chest. The streetlight was a beacon in the darkness, and I felt drawn to it, like it was the only thing left in the world that made any sense. As I approached it, I realized there was something beneath it. Something metallic. I reached the spot, and my eyes widened in shock. There, lying on the ground, was my old bike. The one I had lost so many years ago. The same faded blue frame, the rusted handlebars, the worn-out tires. I dropped to my knees, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch it. The bike felt strangely cold to the touch, colder than it should have been, like it had been abandoned here for years. And yet, as I ran my fingers over the rusted frame, I could feel a strange pulse, a hum, almost like it was alive. I stood up quickly, looking around. The streetlight flickered above me, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. The map in my hand felt heavier now, like it was pulling me towards something. I couldn't stop myself from unfolding it once again. And there it was, marked clearly in red, a location just a few blocks away, a place I couldn't recall ever seeing, but one that seemed strangely familiar nonetheless. The map had already shifted, had already chosen its next destination. I didn't have time to think. I had no choice but to follow it. I picked up the bike, feeling its cold weight in my hands, and started walking toward the next destination. The streets around me were empty, the only sound being the soft scrape of the bike tires against the ground. The streetlights flickered above me, casting everything in an unsettling, half-lit glow. The more I walked, the more I began to feel like the streets were changing. The buildings around me, once familiar, seemed to shift and warp as if they were being rearranged by some unseen force. The air grew colder, and the silence deepened, becoming almost suffocating. I glanced at the map again, but it had changed. The lines on the page no longer made sense. The streets I had just passed through were no longer there. The map was becoming a maze, leading me down paths I couldn't escape. And then I saw it. The building at the end of the street. It was tall, dark, and looming, its windows reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. The map had circled this building in red, marking it as the final destination. I stopped in my tracks. The building was wrong. There was something about it, something that made my stomach churn and my skin crawl. But I didn't have time to question it. I had already come this far. I had no choice but to go inside. I pushed open the door, and the creak of the hinges echoed in the silence. The air inside was cold and stale, and the room beyond was dark, lit only by the dim light filtering through the dirty windows. I stepped inside, the door closing behind me with a soft thud. The room was empty, at least it seemed empty. But then I heard it. A faint sound, like the scraping of metal against stone. Slowly, cautiously, I turned to look. At the far end of the room, I saw it. A figure. It was sitting on the floor, its back to me. The faintest glimmer of light caught the edge of something metallic beside it, another bike. My heart skipped a beat. It was mine. The bike. But it wasn't the one I had just found. It was the one I had lost all those years ago. The one that had disappeared without a trace. I stepped forward, my legs feeling like lead as I moved toward the figure. The scraping sound grew louder, more frantic, like something was being dragged across the floor. And then, as I got closer, the figure turned to face me. It was me again. But this time, its eyes were completely black. And it was smiling. I froze, unable to breathe. The sight of myself, sitting there in that dim, cold room with those eyes, those black, empty eyes, was too much. It felt like my own soul had been ripped from me and replaced with something else. Something hollow. It smiled at me. Not the way I would smile, not the smile of recognition or curiosity, but something darker, something sinister. The kind of smile that said it knew everything about me, every secret, every fear. And it knew exactly how to make me feel small. I took a step back, my feet unsteady, my body trembling uncontrollably. But it wasn't enough to escape. The room felt like it was closing in, its walls shifting and twisting, warping with each breath I took. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, growing longer, darker, as if they were alive. "I've been waiting for you," the figure said, its voice a low, mocking echo of mine. It didn't sound like me anymore. It didn't sound human. It was something else, something unnatural. I wanted to scream, but the sound was lodged in my throat. My hands gripped the map harder, the edges digging into my palms. The map, it was still there, still pulsing, still calling to me. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't let it go. You don't understand, I said, my voice barely a whisper, trembling with fear and desperation. I didn't choose this. I didn't ask for this. This is all, it's all a mistake. The figure tilted its head, its smile widening, stretching unnaturally. A mistake? No. This was always meant to happen. You followed the path, didn't you? You came here. You chose to find this place. It stood up slowly, its movements jerky, unnatural. And as it moved, the light flickered again, casting shadows that seemed to dance and curl around the figure as if they were alive. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like something was holding me in place, forcing me to face what I had found. The figure took a step toward me, its grin widening further, revealing sharp, uneven teeth. You've always been drawn to this. Always looking for something you can't explain. This map? It was your invitation. You followed it. And now, it paused, and the room grew colder. Now you'll stay. I could feel the weight of its words pressing on my chest, suffocating me. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as I struggled to think, to find a way out. But there was no way out. Not here. Not with the map still in my hands, the destination still clear, pulling me towards something I could no longer control. You were always meant to find it, the figure continued, its voice growing colder. The map isn't just a guide. It's a trap. And you've been caught. I clenched my fists, fighting the panic that was clawing at me. I couldn't let this be the end. I couldn't let this thing take over my life, my memories, my sense of self. I had to fight. But as I lifted my hand, ready to throw the map away, a low, echoing laugh filled the room. Do you think you can escape? The figure taunted, stepping closer. You can't. The map chose you, just as it's chosen everyone before you. There's no escape from what you've become. And then, just like that, everything around me shifted. The walls of the room melted away, and the space around me expanded, the world turning into a blur of shifting shapes and dark, empty voids. I felt my body pulled in every direction, spinning in a dizzying vortex. The map slipped from my hands and floated away, becoming part of the swirling chaos, part of the endless void that seemed to stretch on forever. I reached out, desperate to grab onto something, anything, but there was nothing. No ground beneath my feet. No walls to hold me. Only darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. I opened my eyes. I was standing outside again, the familiar streets of my city surrounding me. But something was wrong. The buildings, the sky, they all felt distorted, like they were copies of the world I once knew, but twisted, unnatural. I looked down at my hands. They were still shaking, and I could still feel the pressure of the map's pull in my mind. The desire to follow it, to find the next location, to keep going. I couldn't stop. I didn't know if I wanted to stop. The bike, my bike, was no longer in my hands, but I could hear its faint squeak in the distance, as if it was calling to me. And in the distance, I saw it. The streetlight, just like the one from the map. The place where everything had started. I couldn't escape. The map had already marked me. I was already part of it. And I knew, with a sinking feeling in my gut, that it would never stop. Have you ever had the feeling that something in your life is being decided for you? That somewhere, somehow, someone knows your next move before you even make it? I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Maybe it's just my overactive imagination, or maybe it's the stress of trying to figure out my life. But lately, nothing feels like a choice anymore. It's like I'm following a path that's already been laid out for me. The first time I noticed something strange, it was in my mailbox. It was a normal Tuesday, just like any other. I opened the door, and there it was, one letter, an envelope with no return address. My name was written in neat, block letters across the front. Nothing unusual about that, at first. But when I opened it, that's when things started to feel off. Inside was a postcard. The kind you might send from a vacation spot, bright colors, with a picture of a place you've never been but always wanted to visit. But the picture on this card, it was my future apartment. The place I had been looking at for weeks, the one I kept returning to in my mind. I'd seen it online, but I hadn't made any final decisions yet. How could they know? How could anyone know? It wasn't just the apartment, though. It was everything about it, every small detail, down to the layout of the rooms, the light coming in through the window, even the way the shadows fell across the floor in the late afternoon. It was exactly the apartment I had been drawn to, the one I was starting to believe might be the place for me. I flipped the card over, hoping to find some kind of explanation, but there was only a short message written in the same neat handwriting. We knew you would choose this one. That's when the unease settled in. Who were they? How could they know what I would choose? The card wasn't signed. No name. No address. Just that one cryptic message. I sat there on the front step, the card in my hands, staring at the apartment on the postcard. I tried to convince myself that it was a strange coincidence. Maybe it was some sort of marketing gimmick, a way for a real estate agent to get my attention. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something about it felt wrong. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just a postcard. It was everything. Every choice I made felt like it had already been made for me. Every conversation seemed rehearsed, like I had said these words before, even though I knew I hadn't. It was as if my life was slowly being rewritten by someone, and I was just a passenger. I found myself at that apartment building again. I hadn't planned on going there, but somehow my feet had led me to it. The same sense of inevitability tugged at me as I walked through the door, up the stairs, and into the unit I had been obsessing over for days. And there it was, exactly as I had imagined it, as if it had been waiting for me. But this time, something was different. As I stepped inside, I felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on me. The air was thick, heavy with an unspoken tension, as though the apartment itself knew I was meant to be here. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards echoed louder than usual, amplifying the strange sensation that I was no longer in control. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls seemed to close in around me, and for a moment, I felt like I was being pulled into something I couldn't understand, something that wasn't just a place, but a trap. The doorbell rang, sharp and sudden, breaking the eerie quiet. I turned toward the door, my heart skipping a beat. No one was supposed to be here. No one knew I was coming. But I could hear the faint shuffle of footsteps outside, followed by a knock. I moved toward the door, my breath shallow, and opened it. There was no one there. Just a single envelope, sitting on the doormat. My hands were clammy as I picked it up. I opened it without hesitation, knowing I had no choice but to find out what was inside. A single sheet of paper. Welcome home. The words were typed, not handwritten this time, but the effect was the same. My heart raced as I read them over and over, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The apartment. The postcard. The strange sense of being led here. It was all connected. But who was leading me? And why? The sound of a door creaking in the distance snapped me out of my thoughts. It wasn't the apartment's door. It was coming from somewhere else. Somewhere deeper inside the building. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest. The apartment that felt like home now felt like something else entirely. Something unfamiliar. The walls, the air, even the light, all of it felt wrong now. I wasn't alone anymore. I closed the door behind me, my hand shaking as I locked it. I leaned against it for a moment, trying to steady my breath, but the panic that had started in my chest refused to go away. The apartment felt off, like it was too much a part of me and yet completely unfamiliar. Every step I took, every corner I turned, felt like I was being watched by invisible eyes, waiting for me to make my next move. The envelope was still in my hands, the words "Welcome Home" printed on the page. The phrase lingered in my mind, echoing like a haunting melody. I didn't feel welcome. I felt trapped. The sound of the door creaking echoed again, coming from down the hall. A low, almost imperceptible groan of wood, like something, or someone, was moving in the shadows. I wasn't sure if it was real, or if my mind was starting to play tricks on me. My pulse quickened, and the silence that followed felt deafening. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just leave. I had no place to go. The apartment was too familiar, too right for me to turn away from. But something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones, a creeping unease that grew with every passing second. I made my way to the kitchen, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was just stress. Maybe it was all in my head. I had been under a lot of pressure lately, and the idea of a new apartment, a fresh start, had been the only thing keeping me going. But the more I thought about it, the more everything seemed connected. Like the postcard, the envelope, the feeling that I was being led here, it was all part of some plan, some force pulling me towards something I wasn't ready for. I opened the fridge, hoping to distract myself, but it was empty. No food. No drinks. Just a few bottles of water. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the empty shelves. I hadn't noticed it before, but the entire apartment seemed devoid of life. There were no personal touches, no photographs, no items that suggested anyone had ever lived here. It was a place frozen in time, waiting for me to fill it with memories, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had already been filled with something else. Suddenly, the apartment door rattled. The knob twisted, the sound of a heavy hand pressing against the wood. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. The footsteps in the hall were closer now, too close. I could hear them, slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was making their way toward me, methodical and patient. I backed away from the door, my back hitting the cold wall behind me. I didn't know who was out there, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that they had been waiting for me. Waiting for this moment. The walls felt tighter, the air heavier. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could almost feel them in the room with me. Then the door opened. I didn't move. I couldn't even speak. But no one came inside. For a moment, everything was still. The hallway beyond the door was dark, as if the light had been swallowed up by the shadows. There was no one there, but I knew someone, or something, had been. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of my own breathing, shallow and fast. I reached for the envelope again, hoping the words would offer some sort of answer, some way out of the mess I had found myself in. As I turned the envelope over, my fingers brushed against something strange. The paper felt thick, almost like cardboard, but there was something more. A texture. A bump. I pulled it apart, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small photograph, a snapshot of a street I didn't recognize. A cityscape, familiar in a way that didn't make sense. Buildings I hadn't seen before, a park with benches I'd never sat on, a street corner where I had never walked. The photo was taken at dusk, the shadows stretching long, and in the center, there was a man. He was standing alone, staring directly at the camera, his face obscured by the shadows, but there was something in his posture that made my stomach turn. I didn't know him. Or at least, I didn't think I did. But the longer I stared at the photo, the more it felt like I should. Like I did know him. The feeling crept through me, sinking deeper with every passing second. And then, the strangest thing happened. The photo began to change. The man's face shifted, slowly at first, like a mirage trying to come into focus. It wasn't the same man anymore. It was me. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was me, standing in that exact spot, staring out from the photograph, with the same look of uncertainty in my eyes. I could feel it in my chest, an overwhelming pressure, like 1,000 thoughts crashing into me all at once. I let out a breath, my mind reeling. This was no longer a coincidence. This was no longer some marketing ploy or mistake. This was something else. Something far beyond my understanding. The apartment wasn't just a place I was meant to live. It was a place I was meant to be. And somehow, I had been pulled here, guided every step of the way. The postcard. The envelope. The photograph. It was all part of the plan. But whose plan? The footsteps outside the door began again, slow and deliberate. This time, I didn't wait for the door to open. I didn't care if I was ready or not. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I didn't know where I was running, but I couldn't stop. My feet pounded against the hardwood floor as I bolted toward the exit. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from the apartment as I could, but it was as if the building itself was holding me in place, pulling me back with every step I took. The door. I needed to get to the door. The footsteps in the hallway were growing closer again. I could hear them clearly now, sharp and deliberate, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the silence. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was waiting for me. And the closer I got to the door, the more the air seemed to press against me, thickening, growing heavier with each breath I took. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking, but just as my fingers brushed against the cool metal, I heard something else. A sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the window. It was a low murmur, like distant voices. It stopped me cold, like an invisible force was holding me in place. The voices were getting louder. I took a cautious step back from the door, my heart racing in my chest. The murmur grew into words, clear, but not quite in a language I could understand. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to hear. The voices sounded familiar. No, they sounded like me. Or at least, like something I had heard before. The tone, the cadence of the speech was unmistakable. "Welcome home," they whispered in unison. My breath caught in my throat. The same words. The same feeling of being trapped. The voices weren't just in my head, they were coming from the walls. I could feel the vibrations as they echoed through the apartment, making my skin crawl. The air around me felt thicker now, like I was walking through water, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, stretching toward me, pulling closer. The floor beneath my feet creaked, and the walls seemed to close in, inch by inch. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave. But the door wouldn't open. I yanked at the handle, but it didn't budge. It was like the door had fused to the frame, as though the apartment itself was rejecting me, locking me in. My hands were slick with sweat, and panic began to surge through me. I kicked at the door, pounding it with my fists, but it was no use. The room was growing smaller, the walls pressing in tighter, as if they were closing around me, suffocating me. I turned away from the door, my eyes scanning the apartment in a desperate search for another way out. The windows. Maybe I could climb out. But the windows, they were sealed shut, as if they had never been meant to open. I pulled at the frame, but it didn't move an inch. The apartment was sealed tight, a prison with no escape. The voices outside, still echoing, were getting louder, more frantic, their words now slurring together into an unintelligible chant. I turned around, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I was trapped. Trapped in a place I didn't understand, surrounded by an unseen force that knew more about me than I did about myself. And then I heard it. A soft click. The door, it had unlocked. I froze. The sound was subtle, barely perceptible, but I knew what it meant. The door was open. I hesitated. I knew I couldn't stay here, but the fear of what waited outside was just as overwhelming. What if I was walking into something worse? What if the apartment was the only thing keeping me safe from whatever lay beyond it? But I couldn't think about it anymore. The walls were closing in, the air was suffocating, and the voices were louder now, urging me forward, calling me to the door. I stepped toward it, cautiously, every muscle in my body tense, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. The door swung open in front of me, and I was met with nothing. The hallway beyond the door was empty, stretching out into an infinite blackness, as though the world itself had vanished. There were no lights, no sounds, no familiar shapes. Just a void that seemed to swallow everything in its path. I stepped into it, the ground beneath my feet giving way with each step. The darkness was thick, suffocating, and I could feel my body trembling with the weight of it. The air was colder now, biting into my skin as I moved forward. I couldn't hear anything anymore, no voices, no footsteps. Only the sound of my own breathing, ragged and frantic in the oppressive silence. I didn't know how long I had been walking, but it felt like hours. The darkness seemed endless, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. I kept moving, my eyes straining to see anything, but there was nothing. Only shadows and empty space. And then, out of the darkness, I saw it. A faint light, flickering in the distance. I quickened my pace, desperate for some sign of reality, of something that could anchor me back to the world I knew. As I got closer, the light grew brighter, and I saw a figure standing in its glow. A shadow, tall and indistinct, but unmistakably there. My heart stopped. The figure turned toward me, and I froze in place, my body paralyzed by a sense of pure terror. It was me. It was the same face I saw in the photograph. The same eyes, the same expression, but twisted with something I couldn't understand. It was me, but it wasn't me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped closer, its features becoming sharper, clearer, and I could feel the weight of its gaze as it locked onto mine. It reached out a hand, its fingers long and cold, and for a moment I thought it was going to touch me, to pull me into the darkness with it. But instead, it spoke. "We've been waiting for you," it said, its voice echoing in my mind, cold and distant. "This is where you belong." And just like that, the light went out. I woke up with a start, gasping for air as though I had been submerged in water. My body was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness around me was suffocating, but it was different now, real. The cold metal of the bed frame beneath me, the familiar feel of the sheets, the soft hum of the city outside, it all seemed like a dream, like the nightmare I had just escaped. But the chill in the air was still there, lingering at the edges of my consciousness. I was alive, yes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something had followed me back from the void. I sat up in bed, wiping my face with my hands. The light from the window was weak, just the faint glow of the early morning sun, but it was enough to confirm that I was still here, still in my apartment, still in the real world. I took a deep breath, trying to ground myself, but the sensation of the figure, me, reaching out from the darkness, it lingered. For a moment, everything seemed perfectly normal. Too normal. I glanced around the room, my clothes on the chair, my shoes by the door. The room felt like it had been here forever. But then, I saw it. The photograph. It was lying on the nightstand, face up. I hadn't put it there. I hadn't even touched it since I'd seen it last in the apartment. But there it was, the same photo, the one with the street, the man, and the words "Welcome home." I reached for it, my fingers trembling, and as I turned it over, my heart sank. The back was different now. The message had changed. It wasn't meaning you'd choose it. Now, it simply read, "We're waiting for you. Come back." I felt my throat tighten. I couldn't stay here anymore. This apartment, this place, wasn't just a home. It was a trap. A prison. The place had never been mine. It had been waiting for me to come, pulling me in like a spider to its web. I sprang out of bed, the photo still clutched tightly in my hand. The room felt colder, even though the heat had kicked on. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint drip of water from the faucet in the bathroom, but it was all distorted, like the sounds were being played through a broken speaker. The apartment was coming alive in ways I couldn't explain. The air felt heavier, too, like something was pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The walls were closing in again. I rushed to the door, my mind whirling, but the instant I touched the knob, it twisted in my hand. It wouldn't open. The apartment, the hallway, the world outside, it was all sealed off. I backed away, panic rising in my chest. I turned to the window, desperate to escape, but the blinds were drawn. I yanked them open. Outside, the city stretched out before me, calm and peaceful, as if nothing was wrong. But even as I looked out, I knew it wasn't real. The world outside was just as hollow, just as empty as the apartment I was trapped in. I turned back to the room. The photograph, no, the message, was still in my hand, its words burned into my mind. I had to get out. I had to leave before they came for me again. But as I reached for the door once more, I heard it. A voice, soft but clear, whispering from the shadows. Don't you want to know why? I froze. The voice was familiar, and yet not. It was my voice, but it wasn't. It was the voice of someone who had been here longer than I had, someone who had lived through the same nightmare and come out the other side. I spun around, searching the room for the source, but there was no one there. Just the empty apartment, staring back at me. The voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. Don't you want to know why you're here? I staggered backward, my heart racing, as the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, stretching and twisting into shapes that didn't belong. They were alive now, writhing, reaching for me. The walls were closing in. They were moving, shifting like the skin of a living thing. I tried to breathe, to calm myself, but the air was thick with dread. My body felt heavy, weighed down by the oppressive force that filled the room. Who are you? I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. What do you want from me? The shadows answered, though not in words. They moved toward me with purpose, swirling, pulling closer, until the room seemed to darken even more. The light from the window disappeared as if it had never existed. I was surrounded by darkness, suffocating, unable to escape. And then I heard the footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, like before. But this time, they weren't in the hallway. They were in the room with me, circling around me, closing in. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The darkness was everywhere, pressing against me from all sides. I felt it crawl over my skin, seep into my bones. I was drowning in it. And then, as if it had been waiting for this moment, the figure appeared. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was real. Solid. Unmistakable. It was me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped forward, its face illuminated by a dim, flickering light that didn't belong. It was me, but twisted. Darker. Changed. Why didn't you listen? The figure asked, its voice cold and distorted. You knew what was coming. We all knew. I backed away, my hands trembling as the figure advanced. The walls behind me shifted again, and I realized with a sinking feeling that there was no escape. There had never been any escape. You were always meant to be here, the figure whispered, its cold breath brushing against my ear. And now, it's too late. The world stopped. Time held its breath, and I felt my body freeze, caught between the presence of the figure and the crushing weight of the darkness. My mind couldn't process what was happening, couldn't catch up to the reality that had suddenly spiraled out of control. I blinked rapidly, my hands shaking as the figure, me, stood before me. Its face was a twisted reflection of mine, but its eyes were voids. Empty, black holes that seemed to stretch into eternity. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the suffocating silence. The darkness had thickened, now a heavy, oppressive force pressing against my chest. My heart beat faster, each thud like a drum warning me of something I couldn't escape. It took a step closer, and the air around me grew colder. I could feel its presence as though it were a physical thing, like the very room was alive with malice. The room, the walls, the floor beneath my feet, all seemed to pulse with an energy that wasn't natural. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, leaving only the dark outline of the figure before me. Do you see now? The figure's voice echoed, not from its mouth, but from everywhere, from every shadow that clung to the walls. You always knew. You just never wanted to believe it. I stumbled backward, but there was no place to retreat to. The room had closed in, the edges of the space warped and unreadable. The window, the door, the walls themselves, they didn't feel real anymore. You weren't supposed to find out yet, the figure continued, its voice a cold mockery of my own. But you did. And now there's no going back. I collapsed to my knees, the weight of everything bearing down on me. My mind raced, but there was no clarity, no escape from the truth that the figure was dragging out of me. I was never meant to escape, I whispered, the realization dawning like a slow, terrible sunrise. This place, this apartment, was never mine. No, the figure said softly, it was always yours. It always was. The words settled like ice in my veins, and for a moment, everything inside me seemed to go still. The figure, I reached out, its hand coming closer, and the room seemed to narrow with its movement. It's always been a part of you, the figure murmured, now right before me, its presence overwhelming. The apartment, the messages, the photograph, they were all just steps to bring you here. To show you what you've been running from. I looked up, my gaze locked onto my own face, twisted and cruel. What do you want from me? The figure's lips curled into a sinister smile. I want you to understand. This place isn't just a home. It's a doorway. And you've just walked through it. The words didn't make sense. My head spun, and I could feel the edges of my vision darkening. There had to be a way out of this. There had to be an explanation. But then, as if the world had turned inside out, everything snapped into focus. The walls trembled, the shadows began to pulse, and for the first time, I realized what the figure had been trying to show me. The apartment, the photographs, the messages, they weren't just reminders of the past. They were warnings. Warnings of something much older. A cycle I had unknowingly stepped into. The figure moved closer, its hand now just inches from my face. You're trapped here, in your own mind, it whispered. And you always will be. I tried to move, to escape, but I was paralyzed, trapped in this place, with this thing that was me, but wasn't. The realization hit like a blow to the chest. There was no escaping the cycle. The apartment wasn't just a building, it was a prison. And I was its latest prisoner. Suddenly, the figure spoke again, its voice low and almost tender. But there is a way out. You've always known how to leave. I stared at it, confusion clouding my thoughts. What do you mean? Ow! The figure stepped back, the smile on its face growing wider. All you have to do is choose. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The figure wasn't just a twisted reflection of me, it was offering me a choice, the one thing I had been searching for since the beginning. A way out. A way to break the cycle. But as the figure's eyes locked onto mine, I understood. The choice wasn't really mine. It had never been. The room grew colder still, and the shadows seemed to move, swirling around me like a storm. The darkness was alive, suffocating, and no matter what I chose, there was no escaping it now. I've waited for this moment, the figure said softly, for a long time. I reached out, my fingers trembling, but as I did, I felt something shift within me, something deep and unsettling. The world around me bent and twisted, like the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The figure smiled one last time, and in that moment, I understood the truth. The cycle was complete. I wasn't just a prisoner of the apartment or of this twisted version of myself. I was a part of it. And I always had been. The room faded away, the darkness consuming everything. And as I was pulled into the void, I realized that the choice had already been made. I had always been here, and I always would be. I never thought that a few seconds could feel like an eternity. Have you ever stopped to notice how the smallest moment can spiral into something far more unsettling? It all started on ordinary Tuesday, or at least I thought it was ordinary. I was driving home after a long day at work, the sun already starting to dip below the horizon. The streets were quiet, as usual for that time of evening. Traffic lights blinked in their usual rhythm, green, yellow, red. But when I pulled up to the intersection near my apartment, something strange happened. The light turned red, and I came to a halt, my car idling at the crosswalk. I wasn't in any rush. It was a typical evening, or so I thought. I looked around, checking my phone for messages. That's when I noticed it, the clock on the traffic signal. The seconds stopped. The little green numbers on the countdown timer froze, motionless, as though the very fabric of time had been sliced open and left hanging in place. The world around me continued, or at least it seemed like it did. The cars in front of me didn't move, but neither did anything else. People at the crosswalk, who had been walking only a second ago, were now statues, frozen mid-step. I blinked, my gaze darting between the people on the sidewalk and the frozen clock. This couldn't be real. Was I seeing things? Was I imagining it? But no, it wasn't just the clock. The pedestrians weren't just standing still, they were completely frozen, as though the entire world had suddenly paused except for me. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck prickle. I shifted in my seat, adjusting my grip on the steering wheel. I pressed the gas pedal, just a little. And then, I moved. The car crept forward, a slight motion at first. I glanced again at the clock, still frozen. Then I took a longer look at the pedestrians. They were motionless. I could see their faces clearly now. The woman holding the child's hand, the man with a briefcase, every one of them frozen, as though the whole world was a stage and the actors had forgotten their cues. I tried to shake the feeling that I was dreaming, but I wasn't. I wasn't asleep. I was wide awake, sitting in my car, watching the world around me stand still. I looked behind me, no movement in the rearview mirror. I looked ahead, nothing but stillness. Even the leaves on the trees didn't sway. It was as if time itself had stopped for everyone except me. The eerie silence was suffocating. There was no sound, no wind, no birds, not even the usual hum of distant traffic. Just a dead quiet. My own breath felt loud in my chest, out of place in the stillness. The ticking of my watch on my wrist was the only other sound that dared to break the silence, and it was almost maddening. What was happening? Was this some kind of glitch? A dream? A simulation? I swallowed hard, trying to steady my racing thoughts. I knew I had to make a decision. Something about this didn't feel right. Was it safe to stay? To go? Without thinking, I shifted the gear into reverse and slowly started to back up. The sound of my tires on the road was jarring, sharp against the otherwise suffocating quiet. But nothing happened, no one moved. No one noticed. As I pulled further back, I could see more of the street. It was the same. The shops, the cars, the streetlights, all unmoving. It felt like the world had been abandoned, left frozen in a moment of suspended animation. My heart pounded in my chest as I drove forward again, cautiously this time, looking out for any sign that things would return to normal. But the world still stood still, frozen in place. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, and that's when I saw it, something new. The reflection in the mirror wasn't my own. At least, not entirely. For a split second, I saw the figure of a person standing behind me. Tall, shadowy, its face obscured by the rear view. I jerked the steering wheel around, but no one was there. My pulse raced as I turned back to the front, hands trembling on the wheel. The shadowy figure had vanished. What did I just see? What was happening? I kept driving. My foot hovered over the gas pedal as I pressed forward, but the world didn't change. The frozen pedestrians, the stillness in the air, it was all too much. I could hear my breath now, sharp and fast, as the seconds ticked by. And still, the countdown timer on the traffic light didn't budge. Was I trapped in some kind of moment? And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, the world snapped back into motion. The clock on the traffic signal flickered back to life. The pedestrians, who had been frozen for what felt like an eternity, began to move again as though nothing had happened. The woman with the child continued walking, the man with the briefcase hurried along the sidewalk, and the cars around me started driving again as if nothing had ever been wrong. My hands were shaking, my breath ragged. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't explain what had just occurred. It felt like I had stepped outside of time itself, a brief, horrifying fracture in the world's normal flow. But the world seemed normal again. At least, that's what I told myself. I pulled into a nearby parking spot, my head spinning. The sounds of the city, the familiar noises, returned to me, the honk of a car, the murmur of voices. I could hear it all, feel it all, like I had just woken from a strange dream. But as I sat in my car, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That moment, frozen in time, with the shadowy figure in the rearview mirror, had been too real. Too vivid. Was it all just a trick of my mind? Or had I been somewhere else entirely for those few minutes, caught in a crack in time? I didn't know. But I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And somehow, I knew I never would. The days that followed were a blur, like the world was moving faster than I could keep up with. I tried to dismiss what had happened, to convince myself it was just a moment of stress, a trick of the mind. But the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts like a persistent itch that I couldn't reach. Every time I crossed that intersection, no matter the time of day, the memory of the frozen world would flood back. I'd catch myself looking at the traffic signal, waiting, almost expecting the numbers to freeze again. But each time, the lights would change normally, the world moving along as if nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my chest. Something was different now. I was different. At night, sleep didn't come easily. My mind would replay the moment over and over, the eerie stillness, the shadowy figure in the rearview mirror. I tried to tell myself it was nothing more than a hallucination, a fragment of a waking dream. But what if it wasn't? What if the world had really stopped for those few minutes? What if time itself had been altered? I had to know. So I started paying attention. Every red light, every intersection, every moment where I had a chance to stop and observe. The countdown clock became an obsession. I'd watch it, waiting for it to freeze again. I'd press the gas pedal, just to see if I could make it happen. But the world always resumed, always moved forward. Until one morning. It was a Friday, early, the kind of morning where the city still feels asleep. The streets were quieter than usual, the cars sparse and distant. I was driving down the same stretch of road, headed to work, when I saw the intersection approaching. A few seconds later, the red light appeared. I slowed the car, coming to a stop. And then it happened. The countdown timer froze again. Just like before. This time, I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't tired or distracted. The world around me was still, completely still. People walking on the sidewalk didn't move. Cars at the intersection were frozen mid-motion, like they had been paused in time. And once again, I was the only one who could move. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know whether to panic or to try and understand what was happening. The last time this had happened, I had driven forward, unsure of the consequences. But this time, I felt the pull of something darker, something I hadn't fully understood before. I pressed the gas pedal again, slowly, deliberately, moving forward at a crawl. And just like last time, the world around me stayed still, untouched by my movement. The frozen figures of pedestrians were just as lifeless as before. The buildings, the trees, even the sky, it all felt eerily silent, almost as if everything had been suspended. But this time, I wasn't just curious. I wasn't just trying to make sense of it. I needed to find out what was going on. I slammed my foot on the brake. The car jolted to a stop, and I sat there, watching the world around me. Was I the only one experiencing this? Or was there something, or someone else watching, controlling it all? I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that shadow again. And this time, I wasn't disappointed. There, standing just outside my car, was a figure. It wasn't clear at first. The outline was blurry, like it was a person made of smoke, but it was there. I could see its form shifting in the stillness of the frozen world, growing clearer as it approached. My heart pounded. Was this the same figure from before? Was it connected to the frozen time, or was it something else entirely? Someone, was here with me. I felt a chill creep up my spine, my hands tightening around the steering wheel. I wanted to look away, to convince myself it wasn't real. But I couldn't. The figure was moving closer, its shape becoming more defined, like it was stepping through the air itself, walking with a slow, deliberate pace. I wasn't sure what to do. My instinct screamed at me to drive away, to get out of there, to leave the frozen world behind. But I couldn't move. The car wouldn't start. The engine sputtered, as though the time itself had taken control of everything. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the world snapped back into motion. The timer on the traffic light flickered, counting down as though no time had been lost. The figure, if it had ever been there, was gone, vanished as if it had never existed at all. I stared at the now normal intersection, the cars moving around me, the people walking past, and for a long moment, I was frozen in disbelief. I had no idea what had just happened. Had I seen it all? Was it real? But there was one thing I was sure of now. I wasn't the only one who had experienced this. There was something else, someone else, moving through time with me, watching, waiting. And now, I was certain it knew I was aware. And I didn't know how long it would let me remain in this reality before it decided to do something about it. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, my mind replaying the moment over and over, the figure, the frozen world. It was all too surreal, too impossible. How could I explain it? Who would believe me? The logical side of my brain screamed that it was a hallucination, that I had been stressed or overtired. But a small voice, a whisper in the back of my mind, told me it wasn't. That night, sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of the figure in the rearview mirror haunted me. It was still there, watching, waiting. I could feel its presence even though I had no idea who or what it was. I couldn't help but wonder, why had it shown itself to me? And what did it want? The following morning, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I had to return to that intersection, even if it meant facing whatever strange forces were at play. Maybe I could find some answers. Maybe I could make sense of it. The morning was cool, and the city was quiet as I drove to the same intersection again. My heart raced, but I forced myself to take deep breaths to calm down. I had to keep my wits about me. There was no going back now. As I approached the intersection, everything seemed normal. The traffic was moving, the light was green, and there were pedestrians walking across the crosswalk. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. But then the light turned red, and everything froze. The world around me stopped, just as it had before. The cars halted mid-journey, the people frozen mid-step. I could hear the soft hum of the engine, the faint clicking of the traffic signal, but it was like everything else had been put on pause. I looked in the rearview mirror again, and my breath caught in my throat. The figure was there. Not just in the reflection, it was standing in front of my car, right in the middle of the intersection. Its form was clearer this time, more defined. It wasn't human, not entirely, but I couldn't make out exactly what it was. Its body shifted in ways that didn't seem possible, moving fluidly, like it was made of shadows or smoke. It stood still, watching me, waiting. I felt an icy dread spread through me. It was as if time itself was holding its breath. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I couldn't look away. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The figure didn't move, the world stayed frozen. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, feel the sweat on the back of my neck. I had no idea what it wanted or what I was supposed to do. And then, without warning, the world snapped back to normal. The cars started moving again, the pedestrians resumed their walking, and the traffic light began counting down as if nothing had happened. The figure, whatever it was gone. I sat there, staring at the intersection in shock. My mind was spinning, trying to process what had just occurred. Had I just imagined the whole thing? Had I been dreaming? But no! I knew it had been real. I could feel it, deep in my bones. There was something unnatural at work here, something that was messing with time, with reality itself. I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been frozen along with everything else. What would have happened if I had tried to drive through it? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this go. I couldn't. The next few days were a blur of strange occurrences. The countdown timers froze randomly at other intersections, but each time I tried to replicate what had happened, I couldn't. The world didn't stop again. The figure didn't appear. And then it happened again. A week later, I was driving down the same stretch of road, and the traffic light turned red. The countdown timer began ticking down, and then it stopped. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I knew what was coming. But this time, I was ready. I didn't wait for the figure to appear. I slammed the car into reverse and sped back, hoping to escape, hoping that the frozen world would somehow reset. But it didn't. The world remained still, and the figure, it was there, standing outside my window, only inches away from the car. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, unable to speak, to breathe, to do anything but stare at it. And then, slowly, it raised its hand and pressed its palm against the window. There was no sound, no voice, but I could feel it. The pressure of its presence. The sensation of something pushing against the glass as if trying to reach inside. I knew in that moment that I had to escape. I had to get away, or whatever force this was would consume me. With all the strength I could muster, I floored the gas pedal, pushing the car forward, out of the frozen moment, out of its grasp. The world snapped back into motion. I was back on the road, the figure gone, the light turning green. But I wasn't the same. I couldn't forget what had happened. The image of its hand, pressed against the window, was seared into my mind. The question now wasn't if it was real. It was, what happens next? The days that followed were a blur. The memory of the figure, its hand pressing against my window, haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see it, its shape contorted in unnatural ways, its dark presence pulling at the edges of my mind. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. But I couldn't ignore it either. Something was happening, something bigger than I could understand. I could feel it, lurking just beneath the surface of reality, waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to go back to normal, to put the whole thing behind me. I went to work, I ran errands, I tried to sleep. But every time I approached an intersection, I found myself looking over my shoulder, my breath quickening as I wondered if the time would freeze again, if the figure would return. And then it happened again. I was driving to the grocery store on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the light turned red. I felt my pulse spike, my hands tightening on the wheel. But this time, I didn't freeze. The world didn't freeze. I kept moving, trying to ignore the nagging sensation in my chest, the sense that something was wrong. But then, I saw it. A shadow, dark and formless, moving in the corner of my eye. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there it was, the figure. Standing in the middle of the intersection, waiting. But this time, it was different. Its shape was more fluid, like smoke swirling in the air, shifting and undulating as if it was part of the fabric of time itself. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was following me. I didn't hesitate. My foot slammed down on the gas pedal, and I sped through the intersection, my heart pounding. But I could still see it, out of the corner of my eye, moving through the cars like they weren't even there, closing the distance between us. The world was normal, but my mind screamed that it wasn't. The figure wasn't bound by the rules of time or space. It moved freely, as though reality was its playground. I took a sharp turn, trying to lose it. The figure followed, never faltering, never slowing down. It was like it knew exactly where I was going. I had no choice but to drive faster. The streets blurred around me as I tried to shake it off, but the figure stayed with me. It was inescapable, unavoidable, like a shadow that refused to leave my side. Suddenly, I found myself at a dead end, a small, narrow alley I didn't recognize. The world around me seemed to close in. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I had nowhere to go. The figure was getting closer, its movement smooth and unsettling, like it was made of smoke, like it was a part of the very air around me. I slammed the car into reverse, my hands trembling as I tried to turn the wheel, but it was too late. The figure was there, standing just in front of my car, its form now more solid, more menacing. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears, the sound of the engine revving in a futile attempt to escape. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't move. The world around me felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It stood still in front of me, its form now completely defined. I could see the hollow, empty sockets of its face, its twisted shape frozen in a grotesque mockery of a human being. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence, pressing against me like an invisible weight. The air around me grew cold. My breath came out in sharp, visible bursts. I felt a chill that wasn't just physical, it was in my bones, deep in my soul. I couldn't look away from its eyes, or what should have been eyes. The emptiness in its face seemed to draw me in, as though it were trying to pull me into its own distorted reality. And then, with an eerie, otherworldly noise, the figure slowly began to fade, as if dissolving into the air itself, its form breaking apart like sand slipping through fingers. My heart hammered in my chest, my entire body shaking. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just stared at the empty space where it had been, trying to process what had just happened. The world felt wrong. The air felt wrong. Time itself felt wrong. I didn't stay to investigate any further. I didn't care what had happened, what it had wanted, or how it was able to move through the fabric of reality like that. All I knew was that I had to leave. I threw the car into drive and sped away, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The streets blurred around me, the world speeding by in a haze of confusion and fear. Every corner I turned, every stoplight I approached, I half expected to see the figure again, waiting for me. But it didn't come. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. And I knew that the next time it did, I wouldn't be able to escape. The days that followed were a distorted blur, like I was living in someone else's memory. I didn't know how to describe what I had seen, what I had experienced. Time felt strange, like it was bending, warping, and twisting around me. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was always just beyond my reach, something waiting to come back. I tried to return to normal life. I went to work, did the usual things. But every time I stopped at a red light, every time I walked into a room, I felt the weight of those hollow eyes staring at me from the shadows. It was like I was being watched, every moment, every step. I didn't trust the clocks anymore. I didn't trust the light. One evening, I was sitting at home, my hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in my chest. The house felt empty, silent, except for the sound of the ticking clock on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. Each second felt like it was dragging me deeper into a void. I couldn't shake the feeling that time wasn't real anymore, that it was slipping away from me in a way I couldn't control. I kept telling myself it was just stress, just my imagination running wild. But then the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, and I froze, my heart pounding. The silence was suffocating. The clock on the wall had stopped, its hands frozen at a random time. I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for the lights to come back on, waiting for the world to return to normal. But nothing happened. The darkness stretched on, a thick, oppressive void. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like footsteps, faint and distant. But I knew, deep down, what it was. The figure. It was coming for me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just sat there in the dark, my hands trembling, my mind screaming for me to run. But I couldn't. I couldn't move. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in from all sides. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear them clearly now, step, 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 each one a slow, deliberate echo in the silence. Then I heard it, a soft, low laugh. It wasn't a human laugh. It was something darker, something twisted. I could feel it now, right behind me, the presence pressing against my back, just inches away. I wanted to turn around, to see it, to confront it. But I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to look. I couldn't face what I knew was there. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The footsteps. The laugh. The darkness. Everything went quiet. I didn't move for a long time. I stayed frozen, my body rigid with fear, waiting for the world to return to normal. But it didn't. The power didn't come back on. The clock didn't start ticking again. Time was still, and I was trapped in it. Eventually, I found the courage to get up. My legs were weak, unsteady beneath me, but I made my way to the door. I fumbled for the handle, my fingers trembling as I tried to open it. When I stepped outside, the world was unchanged. The streetlights were on. The air was cold, sharp against my skin. But something was different. The stillness lingered in the air, and I could feel the eyes of the figure watching me from the shadows. I walked down the street, each step echoing in the silence. I could hear the faint buzz of the streetlights above me, but the world felt hollow, disconnected. The figure was out there, somewhere, and I could feel its presence at the edges of my vision. And then, just as I was about to turn a corner, I saw it. The streetlight flickered. Once. Twice. Then it went out completely, plunging the street into darkness. The moment I was in the dark, I heard it. That laugh again. Louder this time. Closer. It wasn't just behind me. It was inside my head. I ran. I don't know how far or how fast, but I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The laughter echoed in my ears, twisting and warping as if the very sound of it was bending the fabric of time itself. The world around me shifted again, as though it was losing its grip on reality. The streets, the buildings, the houses, they all blurred together, as though I was moving through a dream I couldn't wake up from. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I ran and ran until I didn't know where I was anymore, until I lost track of time entirely. And that was when I realized something. The figure wasn't just following me. It was me. It was the part of me that had been lost, that had been left behind, caught in the cracks of time. I don't know how long I've been running. I don't know what time it is anymore. All I know is that the figure is still out there. It's still following me. And I can't stop it. I won't stop it. Because it's already too late. Have you ever felt as if you were being watched, even when you were alone? Or perhaps, like me, you've come across something so ordinary, so seemingly simple, that you couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it than met the eye? That's how it started for me, something so small and unremarkable, it almost slipped past unnoticed. But it didn't. It stayed with me, and now I can't seem to shake it, no matter how hard I try. I had just moved into a new apartment, fresh out of a long-term relationship, looking for something to fill the silence, the emptiness left behind. I needed distraction. So, when I found the old book at a second-hand shop, it felt like fate. The book was withered, its edges frayed, the spine cracked. The cover depicted a misty forest, with light filtering through the trees. It looked like something I might have read years ago, but I couldn't recall ever having seen it before. The price was cheap, the title barely legible, but I bought it anyway. It was perfect for the rainy days ahead. I sat down that evening, curled up in the corner of the couch, the book resting in my lap. As I opened it, the smell of old paper filled the air, familiar and comforting. It was just a book. Nothing strange, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I saw it, the empty chapter. It was like the pages had been printed wrong. Chapter 14, titled in a bold, elegant script, had nothing but a blank page staring back at me. I flipped through the rest of the book, but it was the same. Every chapter was filled with the narrative of a woman, her life, her thoughts, her adventures, until suddenly there was this one page. Blank. I thought it was a printing mistake. Maybe the book had been damaged and some of the pages were missing. But for some reason, I couldn't stop looking at it. I kept turning the page back, tracing my finger over the empty space. It was unnerving, like the words had been erased, as if something was intentionally missing. I turned the page, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that crept up my spine. But as I continued reading, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why was it there? What was the author trying to say? I tried to move past it. Maybe it was nothing, I told myself. Just a printing error, a weird glitch. But then, the next day, it happened. The words on the blank page started to appear. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then they became clearer. You sit on the couch, your eyes fixed on the empty page, wondering why you feel so uneasy. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. My eyes darted to the page, but the text hadn't appeared yet. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. Nothing. But then, slowly, like ink dripping from a pen, the words began to form on the empty page. You've already opened the book, but you can't shake the feeling that you're not the one controlling what happens next. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling. What the hell? That wasn't normal. It couldn't be. It was impossible. I stood up, pacing around the room. My heart was racing, my breath shallow. I needed to get out of here, to break free from this madness. I opened the book again, flipping through the pages as quickly as I could, hoping I could shake off the feeling. But the more I read, the more I realized something horrifying. The book wasn't just recounting the story, it was predicting my actions. The next sentence appeared on the page as I reached for the cup on the table. You reach for the cup, your fingers brushing against the cold porcelain. I froze. It was exactly what I was doing. How could it know? My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was I losing my mind? Was this some sort of elaborate prank? But then the words continued, getting more specific, more accurate with each sentence. They weren't just describing what I had done. They were describing what I would do. And each action, each choice I made, was already written in the book, as if I were trapped in some kind of literary cage. You place the book back down, your pulse quickening as you try to fight the growing sense of dread. I hadn't even realized my hand was moving until the words appeared, describing it. The worst part? It was no longer just a book. It felt like the world around me was watching, waiting. I could hear the sound of the pages turning in my head, even when the book was closed. The next day, when I sat down to read again, the words appeared before I even touched the book. They were already on the page, waiting for me. You feel the weight of the book in your hands, but a sense of dread washes over you as you open the cover again. I stared at the page, my heart hammering in my chest. The book was controlling me. I wasn't reading it anymore. It was reading me. And that's when I realized there was more to this book than just ink on paper. It wasn't just a story. It was a blueprint, a guide for my life. Every move I made, every breath I took, was written on the pages before I even made it. I was no longer the reader. I was the character. And I was trapped in a story I couldn't escape. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't stop reading the book. It felt like an addiction, like something was pulling me deeper, and I couldn't resist. The more I read, the more the pages filled with my life. But not in the way I expected. No, it wasn't just predicting my actions, it was shaping them. I tried to go about my usual routines, but every time I did, the book knew. I'd get up in the morning, make my coffee, and the words would appear. You stand in the kitchen, the aroma of coffee filling the air, but the unease never quite leaves you. I'd sit at the table, staring at the empty cup, and the next sentence would form. You pick up the cup, the warm ceramic in your hands grounding you, but the feeling of being watched lingers, just out of reach. It was happening before I even moved. I wasn't making the choices anymore. The book was. It knew my every thought, my every action, even before I did. I felt like a puppet, and the book was the unseen hand pulling my strings. I tried everything to break free. I closed the book and hid it away, tucked it under my bed, hoping that if I couldn't see it, it wouldn't control me. But even then, it followed me. The words appeared in my mind, written across the back of my eyelids whenever I closed them. They didn't stop. They wouldn't let me go. You lie in bed, the covers tangled around you, but sleep won't come. The book is still with you. I sat up, the words still echoing in my head. The book was inside me now. I could hear the pages turning, the soft rustling of paper, as if the story was unfolding without me. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it was impossible to escape. But then, something changed. The book began to write things I didn't recognize, things that felt wrong, out of place. The words weren't just describing my actions anymore. They were describing things I had never done, places I had never been. You walk down a narrow alley, your footsteps echoing off the brick walls, but there is no one else. The air is thick with something unnatural. I blinked. What? This wasn't right. I had never been down an alley like that. I'd never seen a place like the one the book was describing. It felt like it was pulling me into some other world, a world I couldn't control. You turn the corner, the shadows stretching unnaturally long as the temperature drops. I pushed the book away, my hands trembling. This was too much. I had to get out. I had to leave this place. But I knew it wouldn't matter. No matter where I went, the book would follow. It would always be there, in the back of my mind, waiting to guide me, to shape my every thought and action. But I couldn't let it win. I refused to be a character in some twisted story. That night, I decided to take control. I would stop reading. I wouldn't let the book have any more power over me. It was time to break free. I placed the book in the center of my living room, staring at it for what felt like hours. The words were still there, whispering in the back of my mind, but I ignored them. I had to. With shaking hands, I opened the first page again, determined to end it. You sit in the living room, staring at the book. You know you can't stop now. I froze. The book was describing this exact moment, but it was wrong. I wasn't supposed to be sitting here anymore. I wasn't supposed to be reading it. This wasn't my choice. It was the book's. You open the pages, knowing that each word will pull you deeper into its grasp. No, I couldn't do this. I slammed the book shut, heart pounding. It wasn't just describing me anymore. It was controlling me. I stood up, pacing frantically. I had to find a way to break this, to get rid of it once and for all. The book couldn't have control over me. It just couldn't. But as I stood there, staring at the closed book in the middle of the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The words were appearing again, on the cover this time. You stare at the closed book, the pages waiting for you to open them once more. I felt my hand move, as if on its own, reaching for the book. No. I tried to stop it, tried to pull my hand away, but it wouldn't listen. The book was making me do it. You open the cover, and the story continues, as it always has. The words were already written, waiting for me to fall back into their trap. I had no choice. The book had me now, and there was no escaping it. You read the words, your life unfolding in front of you, but it is no longer your life. It is the book's. The story wasn't mine anymore. It never had been. I realized, too late, that there was no way out. I was trapped. Trapped between the pages, with no hope of escape. And I knew, in that moment, that I would never be free again. I woke up the next morning with a strange sensation. The feeling of being watched had intensified during the night. It was no longer just in my head, it felt like someone, or something, was standing right beside me. But there was nothing there. Nothing visible. I tried to dismiss it, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the lingering effects of the night before. But deep down, I knew the book had a hold on me now. Its words had entered my thoughts, shaping my every action. I couldn't escape it. Not physically, not mentally. I got out of bed and walked to the kitchen. The usual morning sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the clink of dishes, were all there, but they felt distant, distorted. It was as if everything around me was becoming blurred, out of focus. My movements felt sluggish, as though I were moving through a dream. Or perhaps, I thought, through someone else's dream. You stand in the kitchen, staring at the empty cup in front of you. The weight of the book presses on your mind, each page a chain wrapping tighter around you. The words. They were already there, floating in my thoughts before I could even begin my day. I glanced at the book. It sat on the coffee table, open to a page I hadn't seen before. You reach for the cup, but something stops you. The air grows thick, suffocating. I froze. How could it know? I hadn't even moved yet. It was as if the book was controlling me, predicting my every move before I even made it. Or worse, as if it were forcing me to move in a certain way. I could feel my heart rate quicken, my palms growing clammy. The book, its words, they weren't just describing my life anymore. They were dictating it. I needed to get rid of it. I had to. But what if it was too late? What if there was no escape? I snatched the book off the table, flipping through the pages in desperation. Each one was filled with the same eerie writing, detailing my actions, my thoughts. It was all there, written as if my entire life had already been planned out, as if it were a story that someone else was telling. You try to close the book, but your fingers move against your will, flipping page after page. It is as if you can't stop reading. My hands shook as I tried to slam the book shut, but they wouldn't obey me. It was as if the book had become a part of me, like some invisible force was controlling my very body. The story unfolds around you, and you cannot stop it. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, overwhelmed by the sensation of being trapped within the book. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in around me, the air growing thick with an unexplainable pressure. The words were suffocating me. And then, I heard a sound, a soft rustling, as if someone were turning the pages behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. You hear the rustling of pages, the sound of the book being read, but you are not the one reading it. I gasped. The book, it wasn't just describing my actions anymore. It was predicting them. It knew things I hadn't even thought of. It was shaping my reality, controlling my every move. My life was no longer my own. I had to get out. I had to leave. I grabbed my coat, running to the door. But as I reached for the handle, I froze again. The book's words flooded my mind. You reach for the door, but it is locked. The world outside is no longer the same. You cannot escape. Panic surged through me. My breath came in short gasps as I fumbled with the door, but it wouldn't open. It was as if the book had locked me in, trapping me within these walls. I could feel the walls pressing in, the air growing heavier, suffocating. You try again, but the door remains sealed. You are trapped. There is no escape. I stumbled back, my mind spinning. The words, everything was happening just as the book had said. It had known. It had always known. I didn't know how much time had passed when I finally collapsed onto the floor, the weight of the book's power too much to bear. The room was silent, but the oppressive presence of words remained. You fall to the floor, defeated. The book has won. But then, something strange happened. The words, they stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. No descriptions of my movements, no predictions, no whispers in the back of my mind. It was as if the book had gone silent. I blinked, confused. Was it over? Had I somehow broken free? But the silence didn't last long. The words returned, different this time. They were darker. You close your eyes, and when you open them again, everything will change. You will be in the story now, not just a reader. I froze, the weight of those words settling over me like a blanket of dread. No. I had to stop it. I couldn't be a character in someone else's tale. But deep down, I knew there was no escaping now. The silence was overwhelming, but it didn't last long. The book's words were back, filling my mind once again, more insistent than before. I felt them tugging at me, urging me to act, to move. You open your eyes. The world around you shifts, unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. You are no longer in control. My chest tightened as I stood, my legs trembling beneath me. The apartment, the very space that had once felt like mine, was now alien. It wasn't just the decor, it was the feeling of the place. Everything was wrong. The walls seemed to stretch, the corners of the room darkened as if the shadows themselves were closing in, watching. You step into the hallway. The air is thick, too heavy to breathe, yet you feel compelled to move forward. I couldn't stop myself. My feet carried me down the corridor, the walls narrowing as if the building itself were shrinking, boxing me in. Every step felt wrong, forced. The floor beneath me was cold, and the shadows clung to the edges of my vision, twisting and shifting as if they had a mind of their own. I tried to scream, to call out, but no sound left my lips. I couldn't even hear my own breathing. It was as if the world around me had gone deafeningly silent, except for the whispers. The whispers of the words in the book, pulling me forward. You reach the door at the end of the hall. It creaks as you open it, but you are not the one who decides to turn the handle. I stood before the door, my hand reaching out toward the handle. It wasn't my choice. It wasn't me who moved. It was the book. My mind screamed, but I was powerless to stop it. The door opened with a slow, agonizing creak, revealing a room that was both familiar and foreign. A dim light flickered from a desk lamp, casting long shadows that danced unnaturally on the walls. The furniture was just as it had been in my apartment, but everything felt off, as if it were some twisted reflection of the real world. You step into the room, your body moving against your will. A figure stands in a corner, watching you. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't resist. My head turned, my eyes locking onto the figure. It was a person, a woman. No, not a woman, but a reflection. Her face was my own, but distorted, warped by something darker, something unnatural. Her eyes were hollow, empty, as if they'd seen things I couldn't even begin to imagine. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to flee, but I couldn't. My legs were rooted to the spot, my body locked in place. She speaks, but her voice is not her own. It is the voice of the book, of them. You cannot escape. Her lips moved, forming words that weren't hers. They were the words of the book, speaking through her as if she were a vessel, a puppet. You are here because you've been chosen. There is no way out now. You will be part of the story, just like us. I wanted to say something, anything, to argue, to fight, but no words came. It was like I had no voice anymore, like my existence was being erased with every word the book wrote. The room begins to close in on you. The walls move, compressing the space, pushing you toward the figure. The room was shrinking. The walls were closing in on me, the space growing tighter, the air heavier. I couldn't breathe. I felt as though I was suffocating, the weight of the world pushing down on me, pressing me closer to the figure. Her hollow eyes bore into me, her voice now a chorus of whispers. You will never leave. You are now part of the book. You are one of us now. The room spun around me, and the walls felt like they were about to crush me. My heart raced, my vision blurred. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But it was. The book had done this, it had taken control, pulled me into its twisted reality. And now, I was just another character, another page in its story. You fall to the floor, your body collapsing under the weight of the book's power. The figure steps closer, her voice filling your mind. I crumpled to the ground, unable to move, unable to fight back. The figure was right next to me now, her presence suffocating. I could feel her breath, cold and unnatural, against my skin. You have become a part of the story, just as it was written. You cannot escape. No one ever does. And then, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. The world felt like it had stopped. And for a moment, I thought I had escaped. The pressure eased, the weight lifted from my chest, and the darkness began to recede. But as I opened my eyes, I realized something was wrong. I was no longer in the room. You wake up in your bed, but the world is not as it was before. The book is on the nightstand beside you, open to a new page. The words filled my mind, the familiar whispers pulling me into a new reality. The book, it was still with me. I hadn't escaped. I couldn't escape. I looked at the page in front of me. And there, written in the book's cold, unyielding script, were the words I dreaded most. You wake up in your bed. But this time, you will not be able to wake up again. I was trapped. And there was no way out. I didn't know how much time had passed. The room around me, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a prison, a cage from which I couldn't escape. The book was still on the nightstand beside me, open to that dreadful page, its words seeping into my mind like a slow poison. You wake up in your bed. But this time, you will not be able to wake up again. The words were etched into my soul. I felt them wrapping around me, tightening, pulling me into their grip. I tried to push myself up, to fight against the invisible force that held me in place, but my body refused to obey. It felt as though I was sinking deeper into the bed, the weight of the book's power holding me down. I reached for the book, my fingers trembling as I touched its cold cover. It was as if it had a pulse of its own, a heartbeat that echoed through my bones. I knew that if I opened it again, if I read another word, there would be no going back. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what came next. I had to understand what this was, what it was. I flipped the pages, my hands shaking uncontrollably as the words revealed themselves, one after another, like a twisted script of my life unfolding. But the more I read, the more I realized something was wrong. The words were changing. They were no longer just describing actions, they were controlling them. You walked toward the door, your hand reaching for the handle. I tried to stop. I tried to pull my hand away, but it was like I was no longer in control of my own body. My hand reached out, fingers wrapping around the cold metal of the doorknob. I tried to resist, but I couldn't. I was trapped in the book's grip, a marionette pulled by invisible strings. The door creaked open, and I stepped out into the hallway, my mind screaming in protest as my body moved on its own. The walls of the apartment building loomed around me, closing in, the air thick with a sense of dread. I could hear the whispers now, louder than ever before. They were no longer just in my mind, they were all around me. You walked down the hall, each step echoing through the empty space. You can feel it, the presence watching you from the shadows. I turned my head, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway, stretching on endlessly, the shadows flickering and shifting at the edges of my vision. But I could feel it, whatever it was, watching, waiting. The words on the page were guiding me, pulling me forward. But something was different now. The fear was intensifying, the pressure in the air growing thicker, more oppressive. It was as if the very walls of the building were closing in, squeezing the life out of me. You stop at the end of the hallway. The door in front of you is familiar, but you can't remember ever seeing it before. I stopped in front of the door. It was a door I had never seen before, yet it felt so familiar, like it belonged to me, like it was the door to my destiny. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling, but the words in the book told me to stop. You don't open the door. Instead, you turn around and walk back to your apartment. I didn't know why I obeyed. I didn't want to, but I did. I turned around and walked back down the hallway, every step heavier than the last. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent, as if they were urging me to turn back. You reach the apartment door, but you cannot enter. The door is locked, and there is no key. I tried to turn the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as though the world had frozen, the space around me bending and warping as I struggled to understand what was happening. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was like the book had woven itself into my very reality, twisting it, turning it, until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. You feel the presence again. It is not in the shadows, not in the hallways. It is inside you, growing, feeding on your fear. I felt it. The cold, the darkness, it was inside me now. I could feel it growing, spreading like a cancer, infecting my thoughts, my body, my very soul. It was no longer just a book. It was part of me. It controlled me. And I couldn't escape. You open the door. It is not your apartment behind it. It is the end. The end of everything. I couldn't stop myself. My hand turned the handle, and the door creaked open, revealing the black void beyond. The world disappeared, swallowed by darkness. I stood at the edge, staring into the emptiness, knowing that I had no way out. The book had written my fate, and I had no choice but to follow its script. There was no turning back. And then, the words stopped. The whispers ceased. The darkness swallowed me whole. And for the first time since I had picked up that cursed book, I felt nothing. I often wonder how much of ourselves we really put out there. Our digital footprints, shared so freely, make up the narrative of who we are, yet we barely scratch the surface. Or do we? How much can someone know just by looking at a profile? It started on an ordinary evening. I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone. The hum of my apartment was calming, the faint sound of traffic outside blending with the soft clicks of my thumb swiping across the screen. Social media, nothing new, nothing strange. Just the same mix of food pics, vacation photos, and status updates. That's when it caught my eye. A profile. The name was different, yet strangely familiar. It looked like mine, but it wasn't. The profile picture, a familiar shot of me smiling on a beach, the sun low on the horizon, wasn't taken by me. But it was me. Same white dress, same soft waves of hair. I could almost feel the sand between my toes again. But that's impossible. I hadn't been to that beach in years. Curious, I scrolled further. Posts, memories, events. There I was, except none of the places were places I'd been. There were photos from cities I'd never visited, cafes I'd never sat in, mountains I'd never climbed. Each post seemed like a perfect replica of my own life, only off. I froze, my thumb hovering over the screen. My heart skipped a beat. The caption under one photo was familiar, too familiar. It was a quote I once posted a few months ago. A silly line from a book I loved. I'd almost forgotten about it, but here it was again, in someone else's voice. The photo, though? It was taken in a park I'd never been to. The hair on my neck stood on end. I leaned in, staring at the screen. Could it be a coincidence? A bizarre mistake? But as I swiped through more pictures, each one took me further into a rabbit hole of disconcerting familiarity. The stranger's profile mirrored mine in the most unsettling way, but with small details that were unmistakable. I'd seen these places. I knew these faces. But they weren't mine to know. I sat back, the weight of what I was seeing pressing against my chest. My thoughts scrambled. This wasn't just an innocent mistake. Something was wrong. Someone was out there, walking through my memories like they owned them, taking pieces of my life and making them their own. I had to know who this was. Why was this happening? And most importantly, how far had they gone? The room felt quieter now. The hum of the city outside seemed to fade into the distance, replaced by a strange sense of dread, as if the walls around me were inching closer. The air felt thicker, heavier. I set my phone down on the table, my fingers shaking slightly. There was something about this that didn't sit right. Something was watching me. Or maybe I was watching myself. Suddenly, I heard a noise. A sound from the other room, soft, like the shuffle of footsteps across the floor. I glanced towards the hallway. Nothing. The house was silent. Too silent. I swallowed hard. Was I imagining things? I'd been spending too much time on the phone, getting lost in the digital world. But no, this was different. This wasn't just some app glitch. This was deliberate. I stood up, my legs unsteady. My mind was racing. I could feel the air grow colder as I walked towards the hallway. I paused at the doorframe, glancing around the quiet space. It was exactly how I'd left it. But something felt off. I took another step. Then another. And then I heard it again. A soft creak. The unmistakable sound of a footstep. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps weren't from the hallway. They were coming from the living room. I didn't move. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, my breath shallow, my eyes fixed on the living room. The shadows seemed to deepen, as if the darkness was thickening, curling into corners where it hadn't been before. The hum of my apartment now seemed distant, muffled. I couldn't trust what I heard anymore. Another creak. It was closer now. I was certain of it. Someone, or something, was in the apartment with me. I stepped backward, slowly, trying to keep as quiet as possible. My hand reached for my phone, but it was on the table in the other room, just out of reach. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the doorway, where the hallway led into the living room. The silence was almost unbearable. I could feel the air press down on me, cold and thick, like it was pulling me into the room. I glanced at the door. It was slightly ajar. Had it been like that before? I couldn't remember. I always left it shut. Always. The room felt smaller now. The walls seemed to close in on me. I could barely hear anything but my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. It felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. My pulse quickened as my mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening. But there was no rationalizing this. I turned my head toward the hallway again, my eyes darting toward every corner, every shadow. The silence was so thick that even my own breath seemed too loud. Then, another sound, faint, like a whisper. Hello? I jumped. The voice was unmistakable. It was mine. But it wasn't coming from me. It was coming from the living room. I stumbled back, nearly falling over the coffee table. My mind scrambled to make sense of what I was hearing. The voice, it was a perfect imitation. The same tone, the same inflection. It sounded like I was speaking, but I knew I hadn't said a word. I stood there, frozen. The shadows seemed to shift again, darker now, like they were creeping toward me, inch by inch. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the truth. This wasn't just a strange coincidence. This was something deliberate. Someone was mimicking me, my life, my voice, my movements. Whoever it was had learned everything. They had taken my life and twisted it, crafted a perfect replica. But they were getting closer, and that terrified me. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't wait for whatever this was to make the next move. But where could I go? The door to the outside world felt so far away now, as if it might have closed behind me without me even noticing. I hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Then, without thinking, I turned toward the hallway, taking a step toward the door that led outside. I needed air. I needed to get out, to breathe, to feel like I had some control over this situation. The door was right there. Just a few more steps. But then another sound. Closer this time. It wasn't a footstep. It was a scrape, like something dragging across the floor. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned slowly, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The living room was dark, almost unnaturally so. The dim light from the hallway cast long, twisting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The scrape came again. It was coming from behind the couch, just out of sight. I couldn't bring myself to move. Every instinct told me to run, but my feet were cemented to the floor, as if the room was holding me captive, unwilling to let me leave. Then, from behind the couch, I saw it. A figure. A shadow, darker than the rest. It wasn't just a shape, it was a person, or something that looked like one. It stood still for a moment, as if it was waiting for me to notice it, then stepped forward. The movement was slow, deliberate. I froze, staring at it. There was no mistaking it now. The figure was wearing my clothes, the same jacket, the same shoes. It was me. No, it wasn't me. It couldn't be. It was someone else. A distorted version of me, a twisted copy. The thing, no, the person, took another step. It was moving toward me. It knew I was there. My pulse quickened as I backed away, but my legs felt like they were filled with lead, heavy and unresponsive. I wanted to scream, to run, but the fear in my chest choked me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure stopped, its head tilting slightly to the side. And then, in a voice that sounded like mine, my own voice, it spoke. "You know who I am." The words sent a jolt of terror through me. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The room felt smaller still, the air suffocating. "You took everything from me," the figure said, its voice low, mocking. It took a step closer. I couldn't look away. I couldn't run. It was me. But it wasn't me. I felt trapped, cornered. This was no longer just about a stolen identity. This was something darker, something far worse. The thing stepped into the light, its features coming into focus. But they were wrong. The face was too smooth, too perfect. The eyes, my eyes, were empty. Hollow. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as the thing that looked like me reached out. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I wasn't sure if I'd opened my eyes in the same world. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The hum of the city outside was gone, replaced by a dead stillness that seemed to seep into my bones. The air in the room felt thick, pressing against me, as though I were submerged in water. My hands trembled as I slowly sat up, blinking to clear the fog in my mind. I was back in my apartment, but nothing felt right. The familiar surroundings, my couch, my coffee table, the shelves lined with books, looked slightly different, like I was seeing them through someone else's eyes. As if they'd been rearranged in a way that didn't make sense. I rubbed my eyes, trying to focus. My heart was still racing from what had happened, what I thought had happened. Had I been dreaming? Was it some kind of nightmare? But the weight of what I'd seen, what I'd heard, was too real to ignore. I stood up shakily, my legs still weak, and stumbled towards the hallway. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. The door to the living room was shut now, but I could hear a faint rustle, like something was moving on the other side. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I hesitated. Should I open it? What if it was still there? What if that thing was still in my home, waiting? No. I couldn't let fear control me. I had to know. I had to face it. With trembling hands, I reached for the doorknob and slowly turned it. The door creaked as it opened, and my heart jumped in my chest. But the living room was empty. Nothing moved. The room looked normal, just like before. No shadowy figure. No unsettling silence. But something in my gut told me it wasn't right. I stepped inside, cautiously, scanning every corner, every object. The couch, the coffee table, the bookshelves, they were all exactly where they had been. The light from the street outside filtered through the curtains, casting faint shadows across the floor. It looked like nothing had changed. But then, I saw it. On the coffee table. A phone. It wasn't mine. I recognized it immediately. It was the same model as mine, but it wasn't my phone. The screen was cracked, the edges worn, as if it had been used for a long time. But there was no mistaking it. It was an exact replica of my phone. I reached for it, my fingers numb as I picked it up. My thumb hovered over the unlock button. Should I? What if it was some kind of trap, some twisted way for that thing to mess with my mind even more? But I had no choice. I had to know. I had to see. The screen lit up as I pressed the button, and my heart nearly stopped. It was my profile. The same profile I had seen online. The one that had mirrored my life, only with those strange, foreign places. But this time, it was different. This time, there was a message. A single message. I'm waiting. The words were clear, simple. But the meaning, it was a threat, wasn't it? I dropped the phone, the noise of it hitting the table breaking the silence. My hands were shaking now, my whole body trembling with fear. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't breathe. Suddenly, the door to the apartment slammed shut behind me, and I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The air was colder now. The walls felt closer, like they were moving in. I could hear breathing, slow, steady, deliberate. It was coming from behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. The breath was heavy, ragged. It sounded too close, too familiar. Hello? I whispered, my voice cracking, barely a breath. The response came quickly, in my voice. But it wasn't me. I've been waiting for you. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted for the door, my legs moving before my mind could catch up. I fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. My fingers slid across it desperately, but the door remained locked, as if something, or someone, was keeping it closed from the other side. The breathing was louder now. Closer. I could feel it behind me, like it was right at my back. I didn't dare turn around. But then, a sound, a creak, a soft shuffle, came from the other side of the room. I froze. It was moving. Slowly, but it was moving toward me. My mind raced. There had to be another way out. Another escape. I glanced toward the windows. They were locked too. No escape. Nowhere to run. And then I heard it. A voice. "Don't run," it whispered. "You're already here." It was my voice. My own voice, but twisted, distorted, like it was coming from somewhere deep inside me. Somewhere far away. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out beneath me. The room seemed to spin as the walls closed in even tighter. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was getting closer. That thing was getting closer. And no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I tried to escape, it was always there. Always waiting. And then I heard a laugh. A laugh that sounded exactly like mine. I slammed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but it echoed in my head, louder and louder. "No," I whispered. "This can't be real." But deep down, I knew it was. It was real. And it was never going to let me go. I don't know how long I lay there, pressed against the cold floor, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The laughter still echoed in my ears, a cruel mockery of my own voice. It felt like my mind was starting to fracture, slipping away into something dark, something unnatural. I should have been panicking, running, but all I could do was lie there, waiting for the inevitable. It was as if I had already given up, as if the fear had consumed me whole. The air was thick with tension, and the walls seemed to pulse around me, closing in slowly. The breathing stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own heart racing in my chest, the steady thump that felt so loud, so oppressive, that it drowned out every other sound. Then, just as the silence began to feel suffocating, I heard a soft sound, faint, like a whisper. "Look." It wasn't a command. It wasn't even a question. It was a simple statement. And I knew, somehow, that I had to obey. I opened my eyes, the room spinning slightly as I shifted my weight. I looked around, my eyes scanning the familiar, yet alien, surroundings. The walls were still closing in. The shadows were darker now, more oppressive. The light from the street outside barely reached it anymore. Everything felt wrong. Everything felt twisted. And then I saw it. The figure. It was standing in the doorway of the living room, barely visible in the dim light. It was me, or at least it looked like me. The same height, the same build, the same features. But something was horribly off. The face was too smooth, too perfect. The eyes, my eyes, were empty, hollow. The smile stretched too wide, too sinister. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was paralyzed by fear. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. "You still don't understand, do you?" it asked in my voice, the words slipping into my mind like a poison. "This is your world now. You belong to me." My breath caught in my throat. I tried to speak, to scream, but no sound came out. The thing that looked like me took another step, and I instinctively crawled backward, my hands fumbling for something to push against, anything to escape. You're not real, I managed to whisper, the words barely forming on my lips. You can't be. Oh, but I am, it said, its smile widening. I'm as real as you are. I'm just the better version. I shook my head, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. No, this isn't possible. You're just a copy. Oh, a mistake. The figure laughed, a low, mocking sound that sent chills down my spine. I'm not a mistake. I'm you. Everything you wanted to be. The version of you that could live without fear. Without doubt. It stepped closer. I could feel its presence now, as if it were inside my head, creeping into my thoughts. I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut, trying to block out the horrible reality that was unfolding before me. Why are you doing this? I whispered, barely able to breathe. Why? What do you want from me? It paused, considering my question for a moment, and then spoke again. I want everything. The life you built. The people you know. The places you've been. Your memories. It took another step, its voice growing colder, more detached. I want your identity. Because, you see, you're not the only one who's been searching for something. I've been watching you. Learning from you. And now I'm ready to take it all. The room felt even colder now. My skin prickled, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. This wasn't just about my profile anymore. This wasn't just some strange glitch in the system. This was something far worse. Something that had been watching me, following me, waiting for the moment to strike. I had to get out of here. I had to escape before it took everything from me. I pushed myself up, my legs trembling beneath me, and staggered toward the door. My hands gripped the doorknob desperately, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. It had always been locked. No, I whispered, panic rising in my chest. No. I turned around, looking for another way out. There was no escape. The windows were sealed shut, the doors were locked, and the figure that looked like me was getting closer, step by deliberate step. I could feel my sanity slipping away. My mind screamed at me to wake up, to tell myself this was all some kind of dream, but the pain in my chest, the cold air on my skin, it was all too real. I was trapped. Trapped in a world I couldn't control. The figure reached out, its hand hovering just inches from my face. I could feel its breath, cold and foul, as it spoke in that twisted voice that was both mine and not mine. You don't belong here anymore, it whispered. I'm the one who belongs. I'm the one who will take your place. I didn't think. I couldn't. I just acted. With a final, desperate cry, I lunged for the window. My hand scraped the glass as I tried to break it, to shatter the barrier between me and freedom. But as my palm hit the window, a shock of pain coursed through me, and I stumbled back, my vision blurring. The room spun around me, the walls closing in once more. And then, it all went black. When I opened my eyes again, everything was different. The apartment wasn't mine anymore. The familiar furnishings, the couch, the coffee table, the shelves had vanished. The walls were a dull, featureless gray, the kind of color that made everything feel empty, like a place frozen in time, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. It was as if my mind had been severed from my body, leaving me suspended in a fog of confusion and terror. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, parched. I couldn't even hear my own breath. And then I saw it. The figure that had been haunting me, the one that looked like me, was standing in front of me. But it wasn't just standing anymore. It was smiling. That same twisted smile. The smile that was too wide, too sharp, like it was carved into its face. It stepped closer, and I could feel the air around me grow colder, the temperature dropping with each step it took. "You're finally awake," it said, its voice dripping with that same mocking tone. I'd been waiting for this moment. I tried to move, to push myself away, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped in place, as if my very existence had been frozen. The figure leaned down, its eyes locked onto mine. I could see the reflection of my own face in its eyes, distorted, twisted, unrecognizable. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" it whispered. "You thought you could outrun me. But I am you. And you are me." Its words echoed in my mind, reverberating in the empty space around us. They felt like chains wrapping around my brain, squeezing tighter and tighter with each passing second. "No." I managed to rasp, my voice barely a whisper. "No, this can't be happening." The figure smiled wider, a cruel grin that seemed to stretch beyond what should have been possible. "Oh, but it is," it said softly. "You're the one who's been running, but you can't outrun yourself." I closed my eyes, desperate to block out the sight of it, desperate to escape the horror of its presence. But when I opened them again, nothing had changed. It was still standing in front of me, still smiling, still watching. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What is this place?" The figure's smile faltered for a moment, as if considering my question. "This?" It looked around, gesturing to the empty room. "This is your mind. This is where you go when you let yourself get lost. When you forget who you are. When you let fear take over." The words hit me like a slap. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But the longer I stared at it, the more I realized the truth. It was real. This place, this thing, it was all too real. "I didn't forget," I said, my voice growing firmer, despite the fear still gripping my heart. "I'm not like you." It tilted its head, studying me with those hollow eyes. "You don't understand, do you? You're me. You've always been me." I just remembered. I shook my head, my chest tightening. "No. You're just a copy. You're not me." The figure's smile returned, but it was colder now. "A copy? No. I'm the real one. The better one. The one who's free from the chains you've built around yourself." I felt a wave of nausea roll over me, as if the ground beneath me was shifting, slipping away. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But as I looked at it, him, whatever it was, I knew the terrible truth. It was me. It had always been me. I wasn't running from a copy. I was running from myself. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the grayness suffocating, pressing down on me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't escape. The figure reached out toward me, its fingers curling as if to pull me into its grasp. "You're finally home," it whispered. And then it touched me. The world shattered. I woke up in my own bed, gasping for air, my body slick with sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. It was quiet. Too quiet. The room looked the same as it always had. The walls were the same color, the thick, like something was hanging just beyond my reach, watching me, waiting. I sat up slowly, trying to steady my breath. My heart still thudded violently in my chest, my mind struggling to reconcile what had just happened. Was it a nightmare? Was I still dreaming? But no! It felt too real, too vivid. I glanced around the room. Everything was just normal. The same bedroom I'd woken up in countless times. The same soft light filtering through the window. The same dull hum of the city outside. But despite everything looking normal, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That something had changed. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, my knees weak, my head spinning. I needed to get out of the room. I needed air. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't still trapped in whatever nightmare had ensnared me. But as I reached the door, I froze. The hallway was dark. Darker than usual. The faint light from the living room was barely visible through the crack of the door. I took a deep breath, my hand on the doorknob, and slowly turned it. The door creaked open, the sound sharp in the silence. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps echoing unnervingly. Everything was too still. I walked down the hallway, my breath shallow, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My eyes flickered from side to side, expecting something, anything, to jump out at me. But there was nothing. No sounds. No movement. And yet, I knew I wasn't alone. As I reached the living room, my eyes fell on the coffee table. My phone was sitting there, just as I had left it. But something was different. It was waiting. I walked over to it, my hands trembling as I picked it up. The screen lit up. And I saw it. A message. I'm still here. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel my pulse spike as I stared at the words. I knew what it meant. I knew what it was saying. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The phone buzzed in my hand, and I jumped, dropping it onto the table with a sharp clatter. My hands were shaking too violently now to hold it. I turned, my eyes scanning the room one more time. I was shaking uncontrollably, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out. But when I turned back toward the hallway, I saw it. The figure. It was standing at the end of the hallway, just beyond the shadowed threshold. And this time, it wasn't just a silhouette. It was me. My face. My body. My eyes. But the smile. That twisted, inhuman smile. It was stretched too wide, like it was about to split in half. I froze. No, I whispered. No, no, no. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me, watching me, waiting. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, my breath coming in short gasps. My legs refused to move. My body refused to obey. I wanted to run, to escape, but it was like I was paralyzed. Then it spoke. Did you think you could hide from me? It asked, in my own voice, smooth, calm, too calm. Did you really think this was over? I took a step back, my foot hitting the coffee table with a loud thud, but I didn't look away. I couldn't. You're me, I choked out. You're just a copy. You're not real. It smiled wider, tilting its head, its eyes gleaming with something cold and knowing. But I am. I've always been. I'm the one who's real. And you, it paused, its smile faltering for just a moment before it returned with even more malice. You're just the shadow. The reflection. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in again, like they were pressing in on me from all sides. The air was thick, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was suffocating in my own nightmare. I tried to scream, to call for help, but the words stuck in my throat. The only sound that came out was a strangled gasp, barely a whisper. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward. Then another. Closer. Closer. I couldn't run. I couldn't hide. I am you, it said softly, almost tenderly. And you can't escape yourself. Its hand reached out, fingers curling toward my face, and as it touched my skin, everything went black. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.